Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most haunting mysteries. Imagine walking through a jungle in Southeast Asia, and suddenly rising through the trees like ghosts from another world, you see towers of stone covered in ancient carvings. Massive roots thick as your body coil around doorways like serpents frozen in time. And then it hits you, this isn't just a temple, this is a city. A city that once held 750,000 people. More people than medieval Paris and London combined. And then one day, they all just vanished. No goodbye notes, no forwarding address, just silence and the slow creep of the jungle, taking back what was once the greatest metropolis on Earth. So here's the question that's going to keep us up tonight. Where did they go, and more importantly, why? Before we dive deep into this mystery together, I want to ask you something. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story, if you feel that little spark of curiosity lighting up, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, not because I'm asking, but because you genuinely want to see where this journey takes us. And hey, I'm curious about you too. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are? Are you in bed on a couch, maybe walking at night with headphones in? I love knowing that we're all scattered across the world, but for the next couple of hours we're traveling together through time. Now dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan if you have one. That gentle white noise just makes everything feel more atmospheric. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let's step into the jungle together. So picture this, it's 2012. You're an archaeologist in Cambodia, and you've just loaded up a helicopter with some very expensive laser scanning equipment called LiDAR. Think of it like X-ray vision for the ground. You fly over what everyone thinks is just jungle. Dense, impenetrable green chaos, trees that have been growing for hundreds of years. But then you look at your computer screen and the jungle disappears. The lasers strip away the vegetation and underneath streets, neighborhoods, canals, city blocks laid out in perfect grids, reservoirs the size of airports. And you realize, holy hell, we've been walking past an entire civilization. For centuries, people thought Angkor was just the temples, just Angkor Wat and maybe a few other structures. But no, underneath all that green, there was a city covering over 400 square miles. That's larger than New York City, larger than Los Angeles. The largest pre-industrial city anywhere on Earth, and it was hiding in plain sight. You know what's wild? The locals always knew it was there. Cambodian villagers had been saying for generations, yeah, there's old stuff in the jungle, but it took lasers and helicopters for the rest of us to finally listen. Kind of humbling if you think about it. Now let me paint you a picture of what Angkor looks like today, because it's both beautiful and deeply unsettling. You walk up to a temple called Ta Prohm. Maybe you've seen it in movies, it's where they filmed part of Tomb Raider. And at first, you think you're looking at architecture. Stone towers, carved doorways, galleries with walls covered in dancing figures and ancient script. But then you notice something that makes your skin prickle. The trees aren't just near the temple, they're in it. Silk cotton trees and strangler figs, hundreds of years old, have grown through the walls like they're melting over the stone. Their roots pour down like frozen waterfalls, grey and massive splitting blocks that weigh several tons. Some of these roots are so integrated into the structure that if you removed them, the entire temple would collapse. The jungle isn't destroying Angkor, it's the only thing holding it together. How's that for irony? And it's quiet there. I mean really quiet. Even with tourists around, there's this weight to the silence. Like the stones themselves are holding their breath. You stand in those shadowy corridors and you can almost feel it, the presence of all those people who once walked these same paths, who prayed here, who argued and laughed and fell in love and died here. 750,000 people, gone. Here's what gets me, and why I think this story burrows under your skin. We're not talking about some tiny village that got wiped out by a plague. We're talking about a superpower. For 6 centuries, from the year 802 to about 1431, the Khmer Empire absolutely dominated Southeast Asia. They controlled what's now Cambodia, parts of Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. They built temples that rivaled anything in Europe. They engineered water systems that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. They had more than 1 million people living in and around their capital. To put that in perspective, in the 12th century, when Angkor was at its peak, London had about 30,000 people. Paris maybe 50,000. Angkor had 1 million. It was 20 to 30 times larger than any European city of its time. Kings from distant lands sent ambassadors just to see this marvel with their own eyes. And then, it ended. Not in a day, not in a dramatic apocalypse, but in a slow fade. Like a song being turned down until you can't hear it anymore. By the 16th century, when Portuguese missionaries arrived, the city was basically empty. The temples were there, slowly being swallowed by vegetation, but the people, the noise, the life all gone. Now you might be thinking, okay, but cities fall all the time. Empires collapse, that's just history, right? And yeah, you're not wrong. Rome fell. The Maya abandoned their cities. These things happen, but here's what makes Angkor different, what makes it particularly eerie. We don't really know why. We have theories. Oh boy, do we have theories. Climate change, and not the modern kind, but massive droughts that lasted decades. Wars with neighbouring kingdoms, religious upheaval, economic shifts, disease, overextension of resources, infrastructure failure. Some scientists think all of these factors created a perfect storm that the empire just couldn't weather. But here's the thing that keeps archaeologists up at night. For centuries, we couldn't find evidence of a catastrophic collapse. No mass graves, no burn layers indicating the city was sacked and torched. No desperate messages carved into stone saying, "Help, we're dying," nothing. It's like everyone just decided to leave, packed up, moved on, and maybe that's scarier than any dramatic ending would be, because it means it could happen again. To any of us, to any city, one day thriving the next, empty. But recent discoveries are starting to change the story. That lidar I mentioned, it's revealing things that are genuinely shocking. For instance, we now know that the water management system in Angkor was even more sophisticated than we thought. We're talking about a network of canals, reservoirs, and channels that covered over 600 square miles. The largest reservoir, called the West Beret, is 5 miles long. They dug it by hand. Can you imagine? And here's where it gets interesting. Scientists studying the hydraulic system have found evidence that it was starting to fail. Channels were getting clogged with sediment. Some reservoirs weren't draining properly. The system that had sustained 1 million people for centuries was breaking down. And when your entire civilization is built on controlling water, in a place that's either flooded or parched depending on the season, when that system fails, everything fails. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll dig into all of that later. For now, I just want you to sit with this image. A city twice the size of Manhattan, filled with temples, covered in gold streets, bustling with traders and monks and farmers, children playing in courtyards, the smell of incense and cooking fires mixing with the humid jungle air. A civilization that believed its kings were literally gods walking among men. A people who moved millions of tons of stone to build monuments to eternity. And then silence, jungle, centuries of forgetting until the roots wrapped around the stone so tightly that you couldn't tell where the forest ended and the city began. This is the story of Angkor, the jungle empire that vanished. And over the next couple of hours, we're going to unravel this mystery together. We're going to walk the streets of a ghost city, meet the god kings who built it, understand the engineering marvels that sustained it, and maybe, just maybe, figure out what brought it all crashing down. Because here's the truth that I think makes this story matter. Angkor didn't fail because they were primitive or foolish. They were brilliant. They were ambitious. They adapted to their environment in ways that still impress engineers today. But even brilliance has its limits. Even the mightiest empires are more fragile than they appear. And that's a lesson that feels pretty relevant, doesn't it? Even now in our modern world, with all our technology and confidence, maybe especially now. But I'm getting philosophical, and you came here for a story, so let's start at the beginning. Before the temples, before the empire, before Angkor became the greatest city the medieval world had ever seen. Let's go back to the rivers, to the rice fields, to the people who looked at a swampy floodplain and thought, we can build paradise here. That's where our journey truly begins. You know what's funny about history? We always want to know where things began. Like if you meet someone fascinating, you want to know their origin story, right? Where they grew up, what shaped them, what made them who they are. And empires are the same way. Before Angkor became this mind-blowing metropolis, before the god kings and the golden temples, they were just people. People trying to figure out how to survive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. So let's rewind. Way back, we're talking about the first few centuries after Christ was born. The Roman Empire is doing its thing in Europe. The Han Dynasty is flourishing in China, and in Southeast Asia along the rivers and swamps of what's now Cambodia, Vietnam, and southern Thailand, something interesting is starting to happen. The Khmer people, the ancestors of those who would build Angkor, didn't just appear out of nowhere. They've been in this region for thousands of years, but around the 1st century AD they start organizing into something more complex. And the key to everything, the absolute foundation of their entire civilization, is water. Specifically, it's this absolutely bizarre natural phenomenon that happens nowhere else on Earth quite like it does here. Let me explain, because this is genuinely wild. There's this lake called Tonle Sap, which means Great Lake in Khmer. In the dry season it's big but manageable, maybe 1,000 square miles, about 3 feet deep in most places. Nothing too crazy. But then the monsoons come, and here's where it gets weird. The lake doesn't just fill up. It explodes. It grows to almost 6,000 square miles, 6 times its normal size. It becomes the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia. But wait, it gets weirder. There's a river that connects Tonle Sap to the Mekong, one of the longest rivers in the world. Normally rivers flow one direction right. Water goes from high ground to low ground. Basic physics. Except during monsoon season, the Mekong gets so swollen with water that it literally reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River. The river starts flowing backwards. It's like someone hit the rewind button on nature. And the ancient Khmer people looked at this insane phenomenon and thought, we can work with this. So picture this. You're a rice farmer in the 2nd or 3rd century AD. You live in a small village on stilts near the edge of the lake. Every year, like clockwork, the floods come. The water rises up around your house, under your floor. Fish, and I mean millions of fish, swim in with the floodwaters. It's like the lake is delivering dinner to your doorstep. You drop nets right from your porch. Your kids are splashing in water that yesterday was dry land. Then when the water recedes, and this is the brilliant part, it leaves behind this incredibly rich, fertile silt. Perfect for growing rice. You don't need to fertilize, you don't need to irrigate. The flood does all the work. You just plant your rice in the mud and boom, you've got food for the year. It's almost too perfect. Almost like the gods designed this place specifically for people to thrive. And thrive they did. Now here's where the story gets political, because humans can't just be content with farming and fishing, can we? We have to go and build kingdoms. The first major kingdom we know about is called Funan, though that's actually what the Chinese called it. We're not totally sure what they called themselves, which is a little embarrassing for us historians, but hey, we work with what we've got. Funan existed roughly from the 1st to the 6th century AD, and it was centered around the Mekong Delta. These people were smart. They realized something that would echo through Khmer history for the next 1,000 years. Control the water, control everything. They dug canals, not the massive ones that would come later at Angkor, but impressive for their time. They connected villages, made trade easier, and started managing the floodwaters rather than just surviving them. They built moats around their shrines and temples, not for defense, but for religious reasons. Water was sacred. It was life itself. And here's something fascinating Chinese records from this period describe Funan as wealthy and sophisticated. They had trade connections stretching all the way to India and even Rome. Archaeologists have found Roman coins and Indian artifacts in Funan sites. This wasn't some isolated backwater. These were people plugged into the ancient global economy. And there's always a but isn't there by the 6th century Funan was breaking apart. Maybe internal conflicts, maybe climate issues, maybe just the natural life cycle of kingdoms. And from its ashes rose something called Chenla. Chenla is where things start getting really interesting, because this is when Indian influence kicks into high gear. And I don't mean conquest or colonization. I mean cultural exchange through trade. Here's how it probably happened. Every year the monsoon winds blow from the southwest from India towards Southeast Asia. Perfect for sailing. Indian merchants figured this out and started showing up with goods, spices, textiles ideas. And they didn't just sell stuff and leave. Some of them stayed. They married local women. They shared their stories, their religions, their entire worldview. Imagine you're a Chenla farmer, and one day this trader from India shows up and starts telling you about these gods, Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma. He's got these wild stories about gods who can destroy the universe, with a dance who sleep on cosmic serpents, who incarnate as humans to save the world. And you're like, okay, that's way cooler than our local river spirits. Not that you abandon your local beliefs, the Khmer never fully gave those up, but you start incorporating these new ideas. And crucially, Indian traders brought the concept of divine kingship, the idea that a king isn't just some guy who's good at fighting or politics, he's literally connected to the gods. Maybe he's a reincarnation of Vishnu, maybe Shiva blesses him personally. This concept, this fusion of political power and religious authority, that's the seed that will eventually grow into the god kings of Angkor. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like in Chenla, because I think this grounds everything. It's easy to talk about kingdoms and kings and cultural exchanges, but what about regular people? You wake up before dawn because it's hot here, and you want to get work done before the sun turns the world into a furnace. Your house is wooden, built on stilts about 6 feet off the ground, flood insurance basically. You climb down a notched log that serves as a ladder. Below your rice field stretches out, probably flooded right now, reflecting the purple-pink sky. You're wearing simple cotton cloth. If you're a woman, it's wrapped around your waist and chest. If you're a man, maybe just around your waist. Everyone's barefoot. Shoes are for weird foreigners. Your whole family works the rice field together. It's back-breaking labor. You're bent over all day planting tiny seedlings one at a time in the mud. Your back aches. The sun is relentless. But you're not thinking about that. You're thinking about the harvest festival in a few months, about the fish sauce your mother is fermenting in a jar under the house. It smells terrible, but tastes amazing. About the boy from the next village who keeps finding excuses to walk past your field. Life is simple, but it's not easy. You worry about floods being too strong or not strong enough, about tigers in the forest, about whether the spirits are happy with the offerings you left at the shrine. And at night you gather with your village around fires. Someone plays a drum made from python skin. Someone else tells stories maybe about the old heroes, maybe about the gods from India, maybe just gossip about who said what to whom. Kids are running around shrieking with laughter. Old people are comparing aches and pains. This is the world before empire, before anyone dreamed of building cities that could house 1 million people. This is just life, ordinary human life with all its small joys and constant struggles. But here's the thing about humans. We're never satisfied with ordinary, are we? There's always someone thinking bigger. Someone looking at the way water flows and thinking, what if we could control it? Someone looking at the local village chief and thinking, what if one person could unite all these villages? Someone hearing stories about the gods and thinking, what if we could build them a house so magnificent that they'd have to come live with us? And by the late 8th century, all these ideas, Indian kingship, water management, spiritual ambition, political unity, they're all swirling around, waiting for the right person to pull them together into something unprecedented. The stage is set. The knowledge is there. The people are ready. All we need now is someone crazy enough or brilliant enough, depending on your perspective, to look at this swampy floodplain and say, I'm going to build heaven here. Someone who believes they don't just serve the gods. Someone who believes they are a god. And that someone is about to arrive. A prince with a vision so audacious, so monumentally ambitious, that it will echo through the next 600 years. A man who will take all these scattered villages and forge them into an empire. A man who will perform a ritual on a mountaintop that changes everything. His name is Jayavarman II. And when we meet him next, you're going to understand exactly how one person's vision can reshape the world. There's something about mountains, isn't there? Throughout human history, whenever we want to do something really important, talk to God, make a life-changing decision, declare something world-shaking, we climb a mountain. Moses got the 10 Commandments on a mountain. Buddha found enlightenment on a mountain. And in the year 802, a Khmer prince named Jayavarman II climbed a mountain and basically said to the universe, I'm not just a king anymore. I'm a god. Deal with it. And you know what's crazy? It worked. Okay, let's set the scene, because this moment, this one ceremony on this one mountain, this is when everything changes. This is the birth of the empire. It's 802 AD. In Europe, Charlemagne has just been crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 2 years earlier. The Islamic Golden Age is flourishing in Baghdad. The Tang dynasty in China is at its cultural peak, producing poetry and art that still makes people weep. And in Southeast Asia, in what's now northern Cambodia, there's this mountain called Phnom Kulen. Now, Phnom Kulen isn't Everest or anything. It's more like a plateau that rises about 1,500 feet above the surrounding jungle. But when everything around you is flat rice fields and swamps, 1,500 feet feels like touching the sky. And more importantly, water flows from this mountain. Rivers are born here. In a civilization where water is literally life, the source of water is sacred. This isn't just geology. This is where the gods live. Jayavarman II, and we'll call him Jay from now on because I'm getting tired of saying that Mouthful Jay had spent years unifying the fractured kingdoms of the region. Fighting some, making alliances with others, marrying into the right families, standard empire building stuff. But he knew something crucial. Military power alone doesn't create lasting empires. You need something deeper. You need people to believe. So Jay does something absolutely brilliant. He stages what might be the most important piece of political theatre in Southeast Asian history. Picture this. It's probably early morning because you don't climb mountains in tropical heat if you can help it. Hundreds of people are making their way up Phnom Kulen. Priests, nobles, warriors, maybe some peasants who got lucky invitations. Everyone's dressed in their finest silk wraps, gold jewelry, catching the sun, ceremonial daggers. The air smells like incense and sweat and anticipation. At the summit, there's a prepared space, maybe a platform, definitely some kind of altar. And Jay is there with the most important person of the day, a Brahmin priest probably brought from India, or trained by someone who was. Because what's about to happen isn't Khmer tradition. It's Indian ritual adapted for Khmer purposes. The ceremony is called a Devahuja, literally the worship of the god king. And here's where it gets wild. The priest performs rituals that declare Jay isn't just blessed by the gods. He isn't just chosen by the gods. He is a god. Specifically, he's the earthly manifestation of Shiva or Vishnu, depending on which version of the story you believe. The priest uses a Sanskrit term Chakravartin. It means he whose wheels are moving, basically a universal ruler whose authority is as unstoppable as a rolling wheel, an emperor whose power covers the entire world, and another term Devaraja, god king, the divine ruler. And with these words, with this ritual, Jay isn't just claiming to be the biggest fish in a small pond. He's claiming to be cosmically, divinely, universally ordained to rule. Can you imagine the audacity, the sheer confidence or maybe arrogance it takes to stand on a mountain and tell everyone, yeah, I'm basically a god now. But here's the genius of it. In the Hindu cosmology that people had been absorbing for centuries, this made perfect sense. The gods did incarnate as humans sometimes. It was part of the mythology. Vishnu had come to Earth as Rama, as Krishna. Why not as Jay? And politically. Oh man, this was brilliant. Think about it. If your king is literally divine, you can't rebel against him without rebelling against the cosmic order itself. It's not just treason, it's blasphemy. It's like fighting gravity. You're not going to win, and you're probably damning your eternal soul in the process. Plus, it solved a problem that had plagued Southeast Asia for centuries. What happens when the king dies? Usually chaos. Brothers fighting brothers. Nobles making power grabs. The kingdom fracturing. But if the kingship itself is divine, if the institution is cosmic rather than just personal, then when one god king dies, another can be consecrated. The divine monarchy continues. Stability. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, this was a masterstroke of political innovation. Now I want you to think about what this moment meant for the people watching. You're a farmer who's climbed this mountain. You've lived your whole life in a world where kings come and go, where your village's loyalty shifts, depending on who's winning the current war where nothing feels permanent or secure, and suddenly standing in front of you is someone claiming eternal divine authority. Someone saying, this isn't temporary, this is forever, this is the way things are meant to be. How would that feel? Scary, reassuring, or inspiring? Probably all three. There are actual archaeological remains at Phnom Kulen that you can visit today, by the way. Carvings in the riverbed, and this is absolutely incredible carvings of thousands of lingers, the symbol of Shiva. They carved them directly into the rock of the riverbed so that the water flowing over them would be blessed before it flowed down to the plains below. The entire river becomes holy water. The empire itself drinks from the gods. Who thinks like this? Who looks at a river and thinks, I need to carve 10,000 sacred symbols into that rock? These people, that's who? The Khmer. They didn't do anything halfway. But let's talk reality for a second. Because while the mythology is fascinating, we can't forget Jay was a politician. A brilliant one, and this religious ceremony was backed by very real military power. Historical records, mostly from Chinese sources and later Khmer inscriptions, suggest that Jay spent years conquering and consolidating. There were at least 8 major kingdoms or principalities in the region before he showed up. By the time he climbed that mountain in 802, he'd either defeated, absorbed, or allied with most of them. The ceremony made it official, made it sacred, but it was sword and strategy that made it possible. And here's something interesting: Jay didn't actually build his capital at Angkor, not yet. After the ceremony, he established his court at a place called Harharalea. We'll call it Harry's Place, because Harharalea is too much of a tongue twister for this late at night. Harry's Place was near modern-day Roluos, about 15 kilometers from where Angkor would eventually be built. But even then, even before Angkor existed, Jay understood something fundamental. He understood that to build an empire in this environment, you needed to master water. So he started construction on reservoirs and canals at Harry's Place. Nothing compared to what would come later, but it was the beginning. The prototype, the proof of concept. Let me put 802 AD in perspective for you, because I think it helps to understand what else was happening in the world. In Europe, Charlemagne is trying to recreate the Roman Empire. He He's crowned on Christmas Day 800, 2 years before Jay's ceremony. Both of them are trying to fuse religious authority with political power. Both of them are building empires that will define their regions for centuries. But here's the difference: Charlemagne's empire falls apart within a generation of his death. His grandson's divided into 3 pieces. Meanwhile, Jay's empire, the Khmer Empire, lasts for more than 600 years. Same basic idea, wildly different execution. In China, the Tang dynasty is producing literature and art that's still studied today. They've got civil service exams, paper money, sophisticated poetry. They're about 100 years from their own collapse, but they don't know it yet. They're still sending ambassadors to Jay's court, still writing about these strange Khmer people who build temples in the jungle. And in the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate is in its golden age. Baghdad is the intellectual center of the world. They're translating Greek philosophy, inventing algebra, building astronomical observatories. All of this is happening at the same time. The world in 802 is this incredible patchwork of civilizations, each one thinking they're the center of the universe, each one absolutely certain they've figured out the right way to organize human society. And Jay, standing on his mountain, declaring himself a god, he's part of that same moment in history. That same human impulse to create something permanent, something that will outlast mortality. But here's what keeps me up at night about this story. Did Jay believe it? When he stood there and let the priests declare him divine when he took those titles, Chakravartin Devaraja, did he actually believe he was a god? Or was he a cynical politician who understood that belief is power, and claiming divinity was the ultimate power move we'll never know? There's no diary, no private letters where he admits, yeah, it's all theatre, but it works. All we have are stone inscriptions, official propaganda basically, and they all say he was divine. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the belief of the people was enough. Because here's what we know for sure. It worked. The empire he founded lasted until 1431. That's over 600 years of continuity. The concept of the god-king became so fundamental to Khmer identity that even now, even today, the Cambodian monarchy still carries echoes of that divine mystique. From one ceremony on one mountain, an entire civilization was born. And that brings us to the next question, the next chapter of this story. Okay, you've declared yourself a god-king. You've got an empire. Now what? How do you actually build something that lasts? How do you take this swampy floodplain and turn it into the greatest city the medieval world has ever seen? The answer is going to blow your mind. Because what the Khmer did next, the engineering, the ambition, the sheer audacity of it, it's going to make that mountaintop ceremony look like a warm-up act. They were about to manipulate nature itself. They were about to move water on a scale that wouldn't be matched until modern times. They were about to build paradise. Let's talk about the hydraulic miracle that made Angkor possible. Alright, I need you to imagine something with me. Imagine you're an engineer and your boss walks in and says, "Hey, I need you to build a city for 1 million people. But here's the catch. You're building it on a swamp. Oh, and you can't use concrete, steel, or any modern materials, just dirt, stone, and human labor. Also, it needs to last 1,000 years. And one more thing, make it beautiful enough that people will still be talking about it in the 21st century. Any questions? You'd probably laugh and walk out right. But the Khmer engineers, they said challenge accepted, and what they created is so sophisticated that modern engineers study it with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, because somehow using nothing but shovels baskets and an understanding of physics that shouldn't have existed yet, they built the most advanced hydraulic system of the pre-industrial world. Let me show you how they did the impossible. First, let's talk about the problem they were solving, because this is crucial. Southeast Asian weather is not gentle, it's not moderate, it's extreme. For half the year you're drowning. Monsoons dump so much rain that entire landscapes become lakes. Roads disappear. Fields flood. If you've ever been caught in a tropical storm, you know this isn't rain like you get in Ohio or London. This is like someone turned on a fire hose, pointed at the sky, and forgot to turn it off. And then for the other half of the year, nothing. Not a drop. The ground cracks, wells dry up, rivers shrink to streams, plants wither, animals die, people die. So you've got too much water, then not enough water. Feast or famine, flood or drought. Now most civilizations in this situation would just adapt their lifestyle. Plant when there's water, survive when there isn't. But the Khmer looked at this problem and thought, what if we don't adapt to nature? What if we make nature adapt to us? That's not just engineering, that's philosophy. That's humanity looking at the universe and refusing to accept the terms offered. The solution they came up with is called a beret. And before you ask, no, it's not a French pastry, though I always think it should be. A beret is essentially a massive rectangular reservoir. But when I say massive, I need you to understand the scale we're talking about. The Westbury, the big daddy of them all, is 5 miles long and 1.3 miles wide. That's 11 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, that's enough water to supply modern-day Los Angeles for about 3 weeks. And they dug it by hand, with wooden tools and baskets. Let that sink in for a moment. No bulldozers, no excavators. Just thousands, maybe tens of thousands of workers, moving dirt one basket at a time. Can you imagine being the foreman on that project? Okay, everyone, we need to move this entire landscape. Should only take a few decades. Grab your shovels. But here's where it gets really interesting. The berets weren't just random holes in the ground, they were precisely engineered. The Westbury sits on an artificial platform with embankments that are 15 feet high and over 300 feet wide at the base. These embankments needed to hold back millions of tons of water pressure. One mistake, one weak point, and the whole thing would collapse, drowning everything downstream. They didn't make mistakes. Those embankments are still there, still holding water after 1,000 years. Now you might be wondering, how did they know how to do this? Where did they learn hydraulic engineering that could rival Rome's aqueducts? The answer is they figured it out, through trial and error, through failure and learning. And we actually have evidence of their failures, which makes the story even more fascinating. There's a site called Khmer, about 60 miles from Angkor, where one king tried to build his own capital in the 10th century. He constructed this massive embankment about 4.5 miles long to create a giant reservoir, except he miscalculated. Recent studies show that the outlet channels were too small. When the reservoir filled during the monsoon, the water had nowhere to go. The pressure built up, and within probably a decade, the whole system failed. The embankment either burst or was permanently damaged. That king moved his capital back to Angkor pretty quickly after that. Expensive lesson learned. But that's how progress happens, right? You try something audacious. Sometimes it fails spectacularly, and then you learn from it. The engineers at Angkor learned. Each beret got better, more sophisticated, more reliable. Let me describe the full system they eventually created because it's genuinely mind-blowing. Picture a network that covers over 600 square miles that's bigger than London, bigger than Singapore. It included 4 massive barries, the West Barry, the East Barry, the Jaya Tataka North Barry, and the Indra Tataka. Each one held millions of cubic meters of water. Hundreds of smaller reservoirs and ponds scattered throughout the city. A network of canals that total over 900 miles. 900 miles of hand-dug waterways, that's roughly the distance from New York to Chicago. Elevated channels that carried water across the landscape like aqueducts, but made of earth instead of stone. And here's the really clever part. The whole system worked by gravity. They didn't have pumps. They didn't need them. They surveyed the landscape so precisely that water flowed exactly where they wanted it to go, just by carefully managing elevations. Modern engineers with laser levels and computer models look at this system and go, wait, how did they measure this accurately enough? Because the tolerances are tight. We're talking about differences of inches over distances of miles. One calculation error and water flows the wrong direction or doesn't flow at all. They did it with bamboo pole strings and math, and it worked perfectly. But let's get to my favorite part of this story, because this is where engineering becomes art. This is where practicality becomes poetry. Every major beret had a temple built on an artificial island right in the center. These islands are called Mebon. The East Mebon, for example, sits in the middle of what used to be the East Beret. It's dry now, but you can still see the temple rising from the ancient lake bed. Now, why would you do this? Why put a temple in the middle of a reservoir? Because in Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain, the center of the universe, sits in the middle of the cosmic ocean. By building a temple mountain in the middle of a rectangular ocean of water, they were literally recreating the structure of the universe. The beret wasn't just a reservoir, it was the cosmic ocean. The temple wasn't just a building, it was the axis of the world. Do you see what they did? They took a practical engineering necessity. We need water storage, and transformed it into sacred architecture. Every time a farmer took water from the beret to irrigate his field, he was drawing from the cosmic ocean. Every time a priest performed rituals at the Mebon temple, he was standing at the center of creation. Function and meaning perfectly unified. When was the last time you saw a water treatment plant that doubles as a cathedral? And we haven't even talked about the canals yet. Oh man, the canals! These weren't simple ditches, some of them were 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep. They had banks reinforced with laterite blocks that's the local stone, reddish and durable. They had spillways to control overflow. They had gates that could be opened or closed to direct water flow. But here's the really cool part. The canal served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were irrigation channels bringing water to the rice fields, transportation networks because it's easier to float stone on a boat than drag it over land, fish farms because the Khmer weren't stupid. Why not raise protein in your infrastructure? Defensive moats around important temples and palaces and ritual pathways for ceremonial processions. One piece of infrastructure, 5 different functions. That's elegant design. And the construction techniques archaeological studies show they would dig the canal pile, the excavated dirt along the sides, to create embankments, then line the bottom with clay to prevent seepage. Sometimes they'd add sand layers for drainage. They understood soil mechanics. They understood hydrology. They were thinking 3-dimensionally about how water, earth, and human activity interact. This is sophistication that rivals anything Rome was doing, and it's happening in the jungle while Europe is fumbling through the Dark Ages. Now let's talk about something that absolutely blows my mind every time I think about it. How did they build stone temples on swampy ground without having them sink? Because that's the thing, right? Angkor, what this massive stone complex weighing millions of tons sits on ground that's basically a sponge. During the wet season, the water table rises to just a few feet below the surface. You can't build skyscrapers on a sponge. So what did they do? They made the temples float. Not literally, but kind of. They understood that if they kept the water table at a consistent level, the temple would rest on a stable foundation of saturated soil. The water pressure from below actually helps support the weight. It's like those fancy modern buildings that have hydraulic foundations, except the Khmer invented the concept 1,000 years ago using nothing but observation and genius. Recent studies using ground-penetrating radar show that beneath Angkor Wat is a complex system of sand layers and clay layers, carefully arranged to manage water flow and provide stable support. They essentially created an artificial geology beneath the temple, and it works. Angkor Wat, built in the 12th century, has hardly settled at all. Modern skyscrapers built on less challenging ground have subsided more than Angkor Wat has in 900 years. How do you not stand in awe of that? Let me give you one more detail that really drives home the sophistication of this system. In 2012, researchers studying the hydraulic network discovered something remarkable. They found evidence of what they called a distribution node near the Taesum Temple, basically a junction where multiple canals met. At this junction, they found a laterite bridge with multiple arches built in the 12th century with dikes and channels that could control water flow in multiple directions. This junction could send water west to the North Baray and West Baray, east to the Roluos River, south to the moats of Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat. It was like a hydraulic traffic intersection, and it still works. When archaeologists cleaned out the ancient canals in 2012, they prevented flooding in modern Siem Reap city. A 1,000-year-old drainage system saved a modern city from flood damage. That's not just impressive engineering. That's engineering that transcends time. But here's what gets me, what really keeps me thinking about this late at night. The level of organization required to build all this, the social complexity. Think about it. To build the West Baray, you need thousands of workers. Those workers need to be fed, housed, supervised. You need engineers planning the project. You need surveyors measuring the landscape. You need foremen managing work crews. You need a supply chain bringing in tools and materials. You need a system to rotate workers so they can still plant and harvest their rice fields. This isn't just engineering. This is social engineering. This is bureaucracy operating at a level that shouldn't exist in a supposedly primitive civilization, and yet they made it look easy. Baray after baray, canal after canal, each king trying to outdo the previous one. Oh, you built a reservoir 5 miles long. Watch me build one even bigger and add 3 temples on islands. Well, it's like the world's most epic one-upmanship competition played out in earth and stone. You know what I think is the most beautiful thing about this whole system? It wasn't built all at once. It evolved. Over centuries, each generation added to it, improved it, connected new pieces to old pieces. The West Baray was built in the 11th century, but it connected to canals that were 200 years older. The system grew organically like a living thing, and that means hundreds of thousands of people, peasants, engineers, kings, priests, all shared a vision, all believed in the same project, all trusted that what they were building would matter, would last. would serve their children's children's children. Can you imagine our modern society maintaining that kind of continuity, planning infrastructure projects that might not be finished for 200 years? We can barely agree on a budget for next year, but the Khmer did it. For 6 centuries, they maintained and expanded this hydraulic system. And it worked. It fed 1 million people. It sustained the largest city in the medieval world. It made paradise bloom in a swamp. Until, of course, it didn't. Until the system that seemed eternal proved to be fragile. Until climate and politics and time caught up with them. But we're not there yet in our story. Right now, we're still in the glory days. The system is working. The water is flowing. The rice is growing. And someone decides, you know what this needs? A proper capital city. Not just Harry's Place, Harry Haralaya. Something grander. Something that will make the gods themselves jealous. Let's talk about the king who made that decision and what he built when he decided to create the first true capital of Angkor. Sometimes the most important decisions in history start with someone standing somewhere and thinking, you know what? This spot, right here, this is it. In 1889, AD King Yasovarman, let's call him Yaso, because we're friends now, stood about 9 miles northwest of his father's capital, and made exactly that decision. And what he chose to build on that spot would become the blueprint for every city that followed. The foundation, the template, the birth of Angkor as we know it. But here's what I find fascinating. He didn't choose the obvious spot. There were closer locations, easier locations, places with better access to the Siem Reap River. But Yaso chose this particular area for one specific reason. There was a hill there, a natural hill rising about 200 feet above the surrounding plain. And in a landscape that's flatter than a pancake 200 feet might as well be Mount Olympus. From the top of that hill you could see everything. The rice fields stretching to the horizon, the vast Tonle Sap Lake shimmering in the distance, the mountains to the north where the gods supposedly lived. It was the perfect spot for a temple, for an announcement, for saying to the world, we're here and we're not going anywhere. That hill still exists today. We call it Phnom Bakheng, and what Yaso built on top of it changed everything. Let me set the scene for you, because this moment when Yaso decides to build a new capital, this is when Angkor stops being a dream and starts being real. It's the late 9th century. In Europe, Vikings are raiding England and France. Alfred the Great is fighting to save Wessex. The medieval period is just beginning, and it's not pretty warfare-plagued feudalism, most people living in wooden huts and dying before 40. In China, the Tang dynasty is falling apart, descending into a period called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. And here in Cambodia, Yaso is planning something unprecedented, a city designed from the ground up as a living, walkable representation of the Hindu cosmos. Not just a place where people happen to live, a sacred geography, a city where every street, every temple, every pond is positioned according to religious and astronomical principles. Think about that ambition. Most cities evolve organically, right? They start as a village, grow along a river, sprawl outward chaotically. But Yaso and his architects sat down with presumably a lot of palm leaf manuscripts and said, let's plan this out, let's make it perfect. And they did. The city Yaso founded was called Yasodharapura, literally the city bearing glory. And its layout was based on a mandala, which if you're not familiar with the concept is basically a geometric pattern representing the cosmos. Squares within squares, circles. Within circles, everything symmetrical, everything meaningful. At the very centre, Phnom Bakheng, the Temple Mountain. This represents Mount Meru, the cosmic centre. Around it they laid out the city in concentric squares. The first square was the sacred precinct temple's ritual spaces, maybe some elite residences. The next square was for nobles and priests, then merchants and artisans, then common people, and surrounding everything at the outermost edge the rice fields that fed everyone. But here's where it gets really interesting. Phnom Bakheng itself is a mathematical marvel. It has exactly 109 towers. Now why 109? Because in Hindu cosmology that number represents the distance between the Earth and the Sun, measured in units of the Earth's diameter. It's also tied to the cycles of the moon, the cosmic ages. There's layers of meaning encoded in the architecture. And the temple has 5 levels. Each level has 12 towers representing the 12-year cycle of Jupiter. Walk around the temple at the right time of year, and the shadows cast by the towers align with celestial events. It's not just a building, it's a calendar, an observatory, a 3-dimensional astronomy textbook carved in stone. When was the last time you saw a government building that doubles as an accurate prediction of the solar year? I'll wait. But let's talk about what it was actually like to live in Yasodharapura, because I think that's where the story comes alive. Forget the temples and the astronomy for a moment. Let's talk about a regular Tuesday in the year 900. You wake up before dawn, everyone does, because the heat later in the day is brutal. Your house is wooden, built on an artificial mound of earth about 6 feet high. Why, raised flooding, obviously. Also, it makes you cooler, the breeze flows underneath. Your house has a thatched roof probably made of palm leaves, woven bamboo walls, very little furniture. You sleep on a mat. Your possessions fit in a couple of baskets. You climb down from your house, and the first thing you notice is the smell. Not bad necessarily, but distinctive. Smoke from cooking fires, incense from the nearby shrine, fish sauce fermenting in jars under someone's house, frangipani flowers, wet earth. It's a smell you'd recognize instantly if you time-travelled there. The streets, and I use that term loosely, are dirt paths between the raised mounds where houses sit. During the wet season, these paths become streams. That's why so many people use boats to get around even within the city. You might walk to the market, or you might paddle a small canoe through the neighbourhood. Whatever works. And speaking of the market, oh man, the market. This is where the city comes alive. The main market in early Angkor was probably near the Siem Reap River, where boats from all over the region could arrive with the goods. And I want you to picture this scene because it's so different from what you might imagine when you think of ancient cities. You've got farmers from the countryside arriving with rice, vegetables, fruits, mangoes, bananas, coconuts, jackfruit the size of your torso. You've got fishermen selling their catch, some of it still alive and flopping in baskets. You've got craftspeople selling pottery cloth tools, merchants from far away, maybe as far as India or China, selling exotic items, silks, spices, jewellery, strange foods no one's ever seen before. Everyone's bargaining, and I mean everyone. Prices aren't fixed, everything's negotiable. You want a fish, you offer a bowl of rice. The seller wants 2 bowls. You settle on 1 bowl plus some vegetables. Money exists, they use silver and gold coins, but barter is just as common. And the noise. My God, the noise. People shouting prices, arguing, laughing. Chickens squawking, dogs barking, pigs grunting, someone playing a drum, someone else playing a flute. Kids running around, probably causing trouble. Old women gossiping, monks in orange robes gliding through silently collecting alms. It's chaotic and vibrant and very, very human. Chinese records from a few centuries later will meet that Chinese diplomat eventually describe the markets in detail. They mention that women do most of the selling. Men do the heavy labour farming, fishing, construction, but the markets are run by women. They handle the money, negotiate the deals, manage the inventory. Which, if you think about it, makes sense. In a society where rice farming requires all hands during planting and harvest, someone needs to handle commerce the rest of the time. Now let's talk about the population explosion that happened under Yaso's reign, because the numbers are kind of staggering. When Jayavarman II founded the empire at the beginning of the century, we're probably talking about a total population in the region of maybe 100,000 people scattered across many villages. By the time Yaso moves the capital to Yasodharapura and starts building, that number has maybe doubled. Still manageable. But then the city starts attracting people. Because where there's a capital, there's opportunity, there's work. If you're a skilled stonemason, you can find employment carving temples. If you're a farmer, you can sell your surplus at better prices. If you're ambitious, you can maybe work your way into the nobility or at least into the merchant class. So people come. And the city grows. By the mid-10th century, just a couple of generations after Yaso, the Greater Angkor area probably has 200,000 to 300,000 people. By the peak in the 12th century, we're talking about maybe 750,000 to 1 million counting the suburbs. To put that in perspective, in the year 1200, London has about 30,000 people. Paris has maybe 50,000. The largest city in Europe at that time is probably Constantinople with about 300,000. And Angkor has 1 million, 3 to 4 times bigger than anything in Europe. This is what historians call a hydraulic civilization, a society where control of water allows population density that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Without the barrays and canals, Angkor is maybe a town of 10,000. With them, it's a mega city. But population density creates problems, doesn't it? You can't just pack 1 million people into one area and expect everything to work smoothly. You need infrastructure, organisation, rules. So let me tell you about some of the clever solutions the Khmer came up with. First, waste management. Yeah, we're talking about sewage. Not glamorous, but crucial. In a tropical climate, if you don't handle human waste properly, you get disease outbreaks that can kill thousands. The Khmer solution was elegant. The canal system doubled as waste removal. Human waste got composted and used as fertilizer for gardens, or it went into the canals where it flowed away from residential areas. The flowing water kept things from stagnating. Was it perfect? Probably not. But it was better than medieval European cities where people literally threw waste into the streets. Second food supply. You need to feed 1 million people every day. That requires organisation. The hydraulic system made 3 rice harvests per year possible, in some areas something that's still impressive today. But you also need supply chains. Farmers need to know their rice will be bought. Markets need to be regulated so people don't get cheated. The kingdom developed a whole bureaucracy just to manage food distribution. Tax collectors doubling as census takers, making sure they knew how much rice each region produced and taking their share to feed the capital. Third, fire prevention. When houses are made of wood and thatch and people cook with open flames, fires are inevitable. The Khmer solution: space things out. Don't build houses right next to each other. Leave gaps. Build ponds throughout the city, not just for water supply, but for firefighting. Every neighbourhood had its own pond. If a house caught fire, everyone grabbed buckets and formed a chain to the nearest pond. These are the details historians sometimes overlook because they're not as exciting as temples and kings. But this is how you actually keep a city functioning. This is the difference between a vision and a reality. Let me tell you about one more thing that absolutely fascinates me about early Angkor, the transportation system within the city. Remember, we're not talking about a compact medieval European city, where you can walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. Angkor spreads over hundreds of square miles. If you live on the outskirts and need to get to the central temples, that's a serious journey. So what do? You take a boat. The entire city is laced with canals, and they're not just for irrigation and waste management, they're highways. People have small boats like canoes that they use for daily commuting. Want to visit your cousin across town, paddle over. Need to bring a cart full of pottery to the market, load it on a larger boat and float it down the canal. Archaeological evidence shows that major temples had docking areas, stone-lined areas where boats could tie up. Can you picture that you paddle up to Angkor Wat, which hasn't been built yet in Yasso's time, but the concept is the same. You tie your boat to a post and you walk into the temple for morning prayers. And for longer distances, for bringing stone from the quarries, 50 kilometers away, they used the natural rivers connected to their canal system. They'd float massive sandstone blocks down the rivers, through the canals, right to the construction site. The temple building program depended on this aquatic highway system. Without it moving, millions of tons of stone would have been impossible. So in a very real sense, Angkor was the Venice of Southeast Asia. But instead of sinking into the sea, they built themselves out of the swamp. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get mentioned enough: what happened to the landscape. Because building a city of this scale changes the environment in fundamental ways. When Yasso arrived, this area was probably a mix of forest rice fields and swamp. Within a generation, it's been completely transformed. The forests have been cleared for construction materials and farmland. The swamps have been drained or turned into managed ponds. The rivers have been diverted into canals. The land itself has been reshaped, earth piled up to create platforms for temples, and houses excavated to create reservoirs. It's terraforming on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. And this has consequences. Recent paleoclimate studies, scientists drilling into lake beds and analysing the sediment layers, show that deforestation around Angkor began as early as the 9th century. Trees that had been holding soil in place are gone. When the monsoons come, more soil washes into the canals and reservoirs. Sedimentation becomes a problem. The system needs constant maintenance to keep working, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In Yasso's time, this is all still new. The system is fresh, the reservoirs are clean, the canals flow freely. The city is growing and prosperous and full of optimism. The idea that this could all someday fail, that's unthinkable. They're building for eternity. Yasso rules for about 20 years, and when he dies around 910, he leaves behind a functioning capital city, a template for urban planning, and a vision that will guide Angkor for the next 5 centuries. But here's the thing about setting a standard: someone always wants to exceed it. Every king who follows Yasso looks at what he built and thinks, that's impressive, but I can do better. And for the next 200 years, that's exactly what happens. It becomes an arms race of ambition. Each king building bigger temples, digging larger reservoirs, constructing more elaborate palaces, each one trying to prove they're the most divine, the most powerful, the most worthy of eternal remembrance. Some of them succeed spectacularly. Some of them fail. Some of them build things so beautiful that people will still be weeping over them 1,000 years later. And that brings us to the Golden Age, the period when Angkor stops being impressive and starts being miraculous. When the god kings aren't just claiming divinity, they're proving it in stone. Let's meet the kings who turned a city into a legend. Here's a question that's been nagging at me. If you could live forever, what would you build? Not just for yourself, but as proof that you existed. Something so magnificent that people 1,000 years in the future would stand in front of it and whisper your name with reverence. Something that screams, I was here and I mattered and I was divine. For the Khmer kings of the 10th and 11th centuries, that question wasn't philosophical. It was urgent. Because according to their belief system, they were divine. They were gods walking among mortals. And gods don't leave behind wooden shacks. Gods leave behind monuments that defy time itself. So for about 200 years, from roughly 1944 to 1150, AD Angkor became the ultimate display of divine ego. And honestly, the result is some of the most breathtaking art and architecture humanity has ever produced. Let me tell you about the kings who turned ambition into stone. After Yasovarman died around 910, things got messy. There's always a succession crisis, isn't there, brothers fighting brothers? Nobles choosing sides. Cousins crawling out of the woodwork claiming they have the best royal bloodline. For about 30 years, the empire kind of stumbles through a series of weak kings and power struggles. And then in 944, a guy named Rajendra Varman II, we'll call him Raj, takes the throne. And Raj is not messing around. First thing he does, he moves the capital back to Yasodharapura from that failed experiment at Khmer we mentioned earlier. Remember the king who tried to build his own capital, and the reservoir failed. Yeah, everyone's happy to forget about that disaster. Raj basically says, okay, we tried something new, it didn't work. Let's go back to what we know works. Smart move. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is admit a mistake and course correct. But Raj doesn't just restore the old capital, he upgrades it. He builds 2 temples that are still standing today, and they're gorgeous. One is called Prerup, which means turn the body. It's a temple mountain where they performed cremation rituals for royalty. The name literally refers to turning the corpse during the ceremony. Kind of morbid, but hey, at least they're honest about it. The other temple is East Mebon. Remember when we talked about the Mebon, those temple islands in the middle of reservoirs? East Mebon sits in the middle of the East Barre, which by this point is probably 150 years old. Raj builds this temple as a statement, look, we're still maintaining the old systems, we're still honouring what our ancestors built, but we're adding our own mark. And here's what I love about East Mebon. It has these life-size elephant sculptures at the corners. Not just decorative reliefs, full 3-dimensional elephants carved from stone, each one weighing several tons. Why elephants? Because elephants are power. They're strength. They're the tanks of ancient warfare. Having stone elephants guarding your temple is like parking a Ferrari in front of your house, except way cooler and much more permanent. But the real star of Raj's reign isn't something he built for himself. It's something built by one of his courtiers, a guy who apparently wanted to score some serious karma points with the king. The temple is called Banteay Srey, and if Angkor Wat is the empire showing off its muscles, Banteay Srey is the empire showing off its jewellery. It's small, you can walk through the whole complex in 20 minutes, but every single surface is carved with such intricate detail that you need to get close just to appreciate it. We're talking about pink sandstone, yes, pink, carved so delicately it looks like lace, like someone took stone and made it soft. The lintels above doorways have entire mythological scenes, gods dancing demons, fighting stories from the Hindu epics, all rendered in such fine detail that you can see individual fingers, facial expressions, the folds in their clothing. There's this famous carving of an apsara, a celestial dancer, and she's so beautiful, so perfectly proportioned, so lifelike, that when French colonizers first saw photographs of her in the early 20th century, they literally couldn't believe it was real. They thought it had to be a modern forgery. How could primitive people make something that refined, spoiler alert? The Khmer were never primitive. They were just working in a material stone that Europeans had mostly forgotten how to carve with that level of skill. Banteay Srey was completed in 967 AD. To put that in perspective, that's almost 60 years before Europe starts building Romanesque cathedrals. The Western world is barely figuring out how to make round arches, and the Khmer are carving stone like it's butter. Now let me talk about something that absolutely fascinates me. How did religious tolerance work in Angkor? Because here's the thing, we talk about the Hindu temples of Angkor, but that's oversimplifying. The religious landscape was way more complicated and interesting than that. You've got temples dedicated to Shiva, temples dedicated to Vishnu. Some temples honour both because, hey, why pick sides? You've got Buddha images showing up alongside Hindu gods. You've got local animist spirits incorporated into the official religion. It's this beautiful, chaotic mix of beliefs all coexisting in the same city. How is that possible? How do you prevent religious violence when you've got multiple competing cosmologies? The answer, I think, is that the Khmer were incredibly pragmatic. They believed in what worked. If you pray to Shiva and your crops grow great, keep doing that. If your neighbour prays to Vishnu and his crops also grow fine, different path, same result. If the local village still makes offerings to the tree spirit that's been there since before anyone can remember, no problem, that spirit probably exists too. This is syncretism at its finest. Not religious tolerance in the modern sense of everyone has a right to their beliefs, more like the universe is big and complicated and there's probably room for all these gods to coexist. And the god kings, they played into all of it. A king might be declared the earthly manifestation of Shiva in one inscription and Vishnu in another. Whatever works for the political moment, whatever resonates with the audience, it's flexible divinity. There's a pragmatism to this that I find really appealing. Religion as a tool for social cohesion rather than division. Can you imagine? But let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the thousands of elephants workers and tons of stone in the room. How did they actually pay for all this? Because building temple after temple after temple isn't free. You need resources, you need labour, you need an economy robust enough to support luxury construction on a massive scale. The answer is rice. It always comes back to rice. Remember the hydraulic system, 3 harvests per year, in some areas instead of 1. That creates surplus. Instead of every farmer barely producing enough to feed their family, they're producing extra. That extra gets taxed. The kingdom takes a percentage, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, depending on the period and the location. That rice surplus feeds an entire non-farming population. The priests who perform rituals, the soldiers who maintain order, the craftsmen who carve stones, the architects who design temples, the bureaucrats who manage everything. You create a whole class of people who can focus on specialized work because they don't have to grow their own food. And the farmers don't necessarily resent this, or at least not enough to rebel, because the system gives them something in return: stability, protection, infrastructure. When your region gets hit by drought, the kingdom's rice reserves can help you survive. When bandits threaten, the kingdom's army protects you. It's a social contract. You give us rice, we give you civilization. Of course, there are probably plenty of farmers who grumble about taxes. That's universal across all cultures and time periods. But the system works well enough long enough to build an empire. Let me tell you about the artisan class, because these people don't get enough credit. When we look at a temple like Banteay Srey or Pre Rup, we think about the king who commissioned it, the architects who designed it, but who actually carved all those details, who spent years of their life chiseling stone under the brutal sun craftsmen, stonemasons, artists, people whose names we'll never know but whose work survived 1,000 years. And these weren't unskilled labourers. This was specialised work requiring years of training. You don't just hand someone a chisel and say, go carve a dancing apsara. They had to learn anatomy, proportion, composition. They had to understand which way the grain of the stone ran so it wouldn't crack. They had to develop the arm strength to chip away at sandstone for hours without their hands cramping. Archaeological evidence suggests there were entire neighbourhoods in Angkor dedicated to craftsmen, potters' districts, metalworker districts, stone carver districts. These people formed guilds, passed knowledge from master to apprentice, took pride in their work. And here's something beautiful. Many of the temple carvings have small imperfections, little asymmetries, slight variations in pattern. These aren't mistakes, they're signatures. Ways for the craftsman to subtly say, a human made this, I made this, because perfect symmetry, that's for gods. Beautiful imperfection, that's human, that's real. Now around the year 1010, a new king takes power and he's going to push the empire to its maximum territorial extent. His name is Suryavarman. Let's call him Surya because that's easier. And this guy is basically the Genghis Khan of Southeast Asia, except with better PR. Surya didn't inherit the throne peacefully. Historical inscriptions suggest he fought his way in, possibly against multiple rivals. There's even evidence of a civil war lasting several years. But once he wins, he doesn't just consolidate power, he expands it. Under Surya, the Khmer Empire reaches from southern Vietnam all the way into what's now Thailand and Laos. At its maximum extent, we're talking about an area roughly the size of modern France. And he's not just conquering, he's integrating, building roads, establishing rest houses for travellers every 15 kilometres along major routes, creating a coherent administrative system across this vast territory. Imagine being a messenger in Surya's empire. You can travel from one end of the kingdom to the other, a journey of maybe 500 miles, and every 15 kilometres there's a place to stop, get water, maybe a meal rest for the night. That's sophisticated infrastructure. That's logistics. That's empire building at a high level. And Surya builds. Oh boy, does he build. He expands the royal palace, he constructs defensive walls around key areas, because unlike his predecessors, who seemed to assume divine protection was enough, Surya understands that sometimes you need actual walls to keep enemies out. Pragmatism again. He also builds a temple called Phimeanaka's, the Celestial Palace. According to legend, there was a serpent deity that lived in the upper tower, and the king had to sleep with her every night to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom. If he failed to show up, disaster would follow. Now, did Surya actually believe this? Did he climb those stairs every night to commune with the divine serpent? Or was it political theatre, a way to maintain mystique, to seem otherworldly and powerful? We'll never know. But the fact that the story survived tells you something about how these god-kings maintained their authority. Mystique, mystery, a hint of danger and magic. Let me talk about one more thing that I think is crucial to understanding this period. The sheer number of female representations in Khmer art. Walk through any major temple from this era, and you're going to see hundreds, sometimes thousands of carved images of women. They're called devatas or apsaras, depending on whether they're gods or celestial dancers, and they're everywhere, standing in niches, dancing across walls, holding lotus flowers, smiling enigmatically. Archaeologists have counted over 2,000 distinct devata carvings in the Angkor temples, and here's what's remarkable. No two are exactly alike. Different hairstyles, different jewellery, different poses, different facial features. It's like someone decided to create an encyclopedia of feminine beauty in stone. Why so many? In Hindu cosmology, these female deities represent Shakti, divine feminine energy, creative power, the force that animates the universe. Without Shakti, even the gods are powerless. It's the recognition that creation requires both masculine and feminine principles. But I think there's something else going on too. These aren't abstract symbols. These are portraits. The faces are individualized, realistic. Some scholars believe the devatas might represent real women, court dancers, queens, noble women immortalized in stone. Imagine being a woman in 11th century Angkor, and you're chosen to model for a temple carving. The artist studies your face, your posture, the way you move, and then your image becomes eternal. 1,000 years later, tourists from around the world will stand in front of your carved likeness and wonder, who was she? What was her story? You don't get immortality like that in many civilizations, but in Angkor your face could become sacred. So by the early 1100s, Angkor is riding high. The empire is at its maximum extent. The economy is robust, the temples are accumulating wealth from donations and royal patronage. The hydraulic system is mature and functioning. The population is growing. Everything looks great. And that's when someone decides, you know what, we need the biggest temple ever built. Not just the biggest religious structure in the entire world. Something so magnificent that 1,000 years from now, it'll be on everyone's bucket list. That someone is about to become the most famous king in Khmer history. The one whose temple becomes synonymous with Angkor itself. The one who looks at everything his predecessors built and says, that's cute, watch this. His name is Suryavarman too, and what he builds next is going to make everything we've talked about so far seem like a warm-up. What's the craziest thing you've ever built? A tree house? A Lego castle? Maybe you remodeled your kitchen and felt pretty accomplished. Now imagine deciding to build something that requires moving 5 to 10 million tons of stone by hand from a quarry 50 kilometers away, without wheels because wheeled vehicles don't work well in swampy terrain. And you're going to arrange all that stone into the largest religious monument the world has ever seen, aligned so precisely with the cosmos that 900 years later astronomers will still be impressed. Oh, and you're going to cover almost every surface with intricate carvings, telling epic stories, so future generations will have something to look at while their jaws are on the floor. That's not ambition, that's divine madness. And in the Alavathirti, a king named Suryavarman II decided that's exactly what he was going to do. The result is Angkor Wat, And if you've ever wondered what happens when unlimited resources meet unlimited ego, meet genuine artistic genius, well, buckle up. Because this is that story. Let's start with Suryavarman II himself, because you need to understand the man to understand why he built what he built. Surya II, let's stick with Surya, probably took the throne by force. The inscriptions are diplomatically vague about this, which usually means violence. There's evidence he fought against his uncle, or maybe his great-uncle, for the crown. Whatever happened, by 1113 Surya is king, he's probably in his early 20s, and he's got something to prove. Young kings are dangerous. They're ambitious. They haven't learned the limits of what's possible yet. And Surya looks at the temples his ancestors built, those beautiful, impressive structures we just talked about, and apparently thinks, that's nice, but I'm going to build something that makes all of that look like practice. And here's the thing. He actually pulls it off. Angkor Wat takes approximately 37 years to build. Let that number sink in. 37 years. Surya commissions it early in his reign, and dies probably right around when it's completed, maybe in 1150. This is his entire adult life, his life's work, his bid for immortality. And you know what? It worked. We're talking about him right now, aren't we? Nearly 900 years later. Let me give you a sense of the scale we're dealing with, because numbers alone don't really capture it. The temple complex covers 402 acres. That's about 500 American football fields. The outer wall is a rectangle measuring 1,824 meters by 802 meters, and those aren't random numbers. Those dimensions encode astronomical and mathematical meanings. Everything is intentional. The central tower rises 213 feet above the ground. Standing at the bottom and looking up, it feels like it's touching the sky. Which is exactly the point, Mount Meru. Remember the cosmic mountain? Gods live at the peak, and the moat surrounding everything, it's 623 feet wide and over 3 miles long. Not just for show, it stabilizes the entire complex, keeps the groundwater at the right level, so the foundations don't shift. But here's the number that really gets me: 5 to 10 million tons of sandstone. Scholars debate the exact amount, but even the conservative estimate is staggering. More stone than all the pyramids of Egypt combined. Except the pyramids are solid blocks. Angkor Wat is a functioning temple with galleries, courtyards, towers, stairways, libraries, intricate spaces carved out of all that stone. How do you even conceptualize a project like this? How do you stand in an empty field in 1113 and envision what it will become? And here's where the story gets really interesting. The stone didn't come from nearby. The sandstone quarries are at Phnom Kulen, remember that sacred mountain, where Jayavarman II declared himself a god king. That's 50 kilometers away. 30 miles. So how do you move millions of tons of stone across 30 miles of jungle, swamps and rivers? The answer. Very carefully and very cleverly. First you cut the blocks at the quarry. Teams of workers using iron chisels and wooden wedges splitting the stone along its natural grain. Each block might weigh anywhere from a few hundred pounds to several tons. Then, and this is the ingenious part, you wait for the wet season. When the rains come and the water levels rise, then you load the blocks onto rafts, massive floating platforms made of bamboo or timber, and you float them down the rivers and canals all the way to the construction site. Recent archaeological work has found the remains of these ancient canals specifically engineered to allow large rafts to pass. They even found loading docks at the quarry's stone platforms where blocks could be rolled onto rafts. This is logistics on an incredible scale. You need to coordinate thousands of workers, you need to time everything with the seasons, you need quality control, checking each block for cracks before you transport it, because there's no point floating a 2-ton stone for 30 miles if it's going to break when you try to carve it. And you need to keep this going for decades, year after year, flood season after flood season, never stopping. Can you imagine being the project manager for this? Okay team, we need another 10,000 tons by next monsoon season. Also, quality is really important, so no pressure, but this temple needs to last forever. Now let's talk about what makes Angkor Wat architecturally unique, because it's not just big, it's brilliant. First, it faces west. Most Khmer temples face east toward the sunrise, that's standard practice. But Angkor Wat faces west toward the sunset. Why? Because it's dedicated to Vishnu, and in Hindu iconography, Vishnu is associated with the west. Also facing west connects the temple to the realm of the dead, suggesting Surya might have intended it as his funerary temple, his eternal resting place. Second, the astronomical alignment is extraordinary. On the spring equinox, if you stand at the western gate at dawn, the sun rises directly over the central tower. This isn't accident, this is precision engineering. They had to survey the land, calculate the angles, position everything perfectly. And they did this without telescopes, without modern surveying equipment. Just observation mathematics and patience. Third, the entire complex is designed to be walked as a spiritual journey. You cross the moat crossing from the mundane world to the sacred. You walk along the causeway, a transitional space neither fully outside nor fully inside. You pass through the western gate, entering the cosmic realm. You ascend through 3 levels representing the earthly world, the world of gods, and finally the highest heaven. By the time you reach the central sanctuary, you've literally climbed into paradise. It's not just a building, it's a pilgrimage compressed into architecture. But let's talk about my favourite part of Angkor Wat, the galleries of bas-reliefs. There are about 800 metres, that's half a mile of carved stone panels wrapping around the inner galleries. And these aren't just decorative patterns, these are stories. Epic narratives from Hindu mythology carved in such detail that you can spend hours just looking at one panel. The most famous is the churning of the ocean of milk. It's this wild creation myth where gods and demons temporarily team up to churn the cosmic ocean to create the elixir of immortality. They use a mountain as a churning stick and a giant serpent as the rope. It sounds crazy, and it kind of is, but the carving makes it feel real and epic and important. The panel is over 50 metres long. There are 92 demons on one side pulling the serpent, 88 gods on the other side. Each figure is individually carved, different faces, different poses, different expressions. You can see who's straining with effort, who's confident, who's maybe having second thoughts about this whole cosmic churning plan. And in the middle, there's Vishnu, directing the whole operation, looking calm and in control while everyone else is losing their minds. This isn't just art. This is storytelling at the highest level. It's a comic book carved in stone. It's a movie freeze-framed into rock. People who couldn't read could walk through these galleries and understand the entire mythology just by looking. What's the last public building you saw that taught you epic poetry, while simultaneously being the most beautiful thing in the city? There's another bas-relief I need to tell you about because it gives us a rare glimpse into actual warfare of the period. It's called the Battle of Kurukshetra from the Hindu epic Mahabharata. But scholars think it also depicts actual Khmer military tactics. You can see the army formations, infantry with shields and spears, archers, cavalry, war elephants. Because of course there are war elephants. You can see commanders on elephants directing troops, musicians playing drums and horns to coordinate movements, supply wagons in the rear. This is documentary evidence carved in stone. This is how the Khmer army actually looked, moved, fought, and Surya needed that army. Because building Angkor Wat was expensive, and you know how he paid for it: conquest. War. Taking wealth from neighbouring kingdoms. In 1145, Surya launches a major military campaign against Champa the kingdom in what's now central Vietnam. He sacks their capital Vijaya and brings back massive amounts of loot, gold, gems, probably slaves, definitely glory. This is the dark side of these magnificent temples, right? They're funded by violence, by tribute extracted from conquered peoples, by taxes that might have been burden on common farmers. The beauty has a cost and not everyone paid willingly. I think it's important to hold both truths simultaneously. Angkor Wat is one of the most beautiful things humans have ever made, and it was built on the backs of tens of thousands of workers, funded by military conquests sustained by an economic system that wasn't exactly egalitarian. History is complicated. Beauty doesn't erase exploitation, but exploitation doesn't negate beauty. Both things are true. Let me tell you something that absolutely blew my mind when I learned it. Angkor Wat was never fully abandoned. Not even during the so-called fall of Angkor that we'll get to later. Unlike the other temples that the jungle really did reclaim, Angkor Wat remained in use. Buddhist monks took it over sometime in the 16th century. Remember, it was built as a Hindu temple. But religions shift, and they've maintained a presence there continuously for 400 plus years. When European explorers discovered Angkor in the 1860s, there were monks living there, taking care of it, performing rituals. The temple was never lost. It just changed religions, which, honestly, is kind of beautiful. The building is adaptable. The sacred space remains sacred even as the names of the gods change. Today, Angkor Wat is both a Buddhist temple and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Cambodia's national symbol. It's literally on the flag. How many buildings achieve that level of enduring significance? Now, I want to talk about something we don't often consider. What was it like to actually work on building Angkor? You're a stonemason. Let's say you're 25 years old when construction begins. You're going to work on this temple for the rest of your life. This isn't a job, this is your identity. Every day you wake before dawn, eat rice, maybe some dried fish, walk to the construction site as the sun is rising. The sound you hear is everywhere, thousands of chisels on stone. Tap, 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 creating this constant rhythm like a massive stone heartbeat. Your job today, you're carving a section of the gallery wall. Your master has given you a design to follow a scene from the Ramayana, maybe. You have to carve warriors, gods, demons, all fitting together in perfect proportion. No mistakes allowed. This is going to be here for 1,000 years. No pressure. Your hands are calloused. Your back aches. Stone dust coats your lungs, your hair, your clothes. It's hot. It's humid. Sweat stings your eyes. But you take pride in your work. Because you absolutely know that what you're making is important. That your children's children's children will point at a particular carved figure and say, "My ancestor made that." Not many of us get that certainty in our work. Most of what we do is ephemeral. Digital files that might not be readable in 50 years. Buildings that get torn down. Products that break. But these stonemasons, they were building forever. That must have felt pretty good, actually, despite the dust and the heat and the aching hands. By the time Angkor Wat is completed around 1150, the Khmer Empire is at its absolute peak. The city has probably close to 1 million people when you count the suburbs. The economy is robust, the military is strong, the temples are spectacular, the irrigation system is mature and functioning, everything looks great, everything feels eternal, and that's exactly when the universe likes to remind you that nothing lasts forever. Because the next major king, Jayavarman VII, he's going to face a crisis that nearly destroys everything, an invasion so devastating that Angkor itself is sacked and looted. The unthinkable is about to happen. But from that crisis, from that moment when it seems like the empire might end, Jayavarman VII is going to build something even more audacious than Angkor Wat. He's going to transform the empire's religion construct, the largest building project in Khmer history, and create some of the most mysterious and haunting art ever carved in stone. Those faces. Those enigmatic, smiling faces staring out in all 4 directions from massive towers. You've probably seen photos even if you don't realize it. Let's talk about the last great god king and why his reign might be both the empire's greatest achievement and the beginning of its end. Every great story has that moment where everything falls apart, where the hero loses everything and has to decide give up or come back stronger. In 1177, the unthinkable happened. Angkor, the greatest city in Southeast Asia defended by the largest army in the region, protected by divine god kings, was invaded, sacked and looted. Enemy soldiers walked through the sacred temples. They stole the gold. They burned the wooden structures. They humiliated the empire. And from that disaster, from that absolute low point, emerged the most fascinating king in Angkor's history. A man who would transform defeat into the empire's greatest building spree. A man who would abandon the old gods and embrace a new philosophy based on compassion. A man who would build so much so fast that he might have accidentally broken the empire while trying to save it. His name was Jayavarman VII, and his story is about what happens when someone with unlimited power decides that what the world needs isn't more conquest, it's more kindness. Spoiler alert, kindness on an imperial scale is really, really expensive. Let's set the scene because the disaster of 1177 is crucial to understanding everything that follows. The enemy was Champa, remember them from earlier. They're the Vietnamese kingdom that the Khmer had been fighting on and off for decades. Surya had sacked their capital in 1145 and apparently they hadn't forgotten or forgiven. In 1177, the Cham launched a naval invasion up the Mekong River and into Tonle Sap Lake. And this is brilliant military strategy, by the way. Instead of attacking overland where the Khmer expected them, they came by water, striking directly at the heart of the empire. The Khmer were caught completely off guard. Their army was probably deployed at the borders expecting attacks from the usual directions. By the time they realized what was happening, Cham boats were already at the city. Angkor burned. The wooden palaces gone, the markets destroyed, the population scattered or killed or enslaved. It was catastrophic. And here's the thing that really drives it home, for a civilization that believed their kings were literally divine, that their city was the cosmic center of the universe. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was a theological crisis. If the gods are on our side, how did this happen? If our king is divine, why couldn't he protect us? The faith itself was shattered. Now Jayavarman VII, let's call him J. 7 wasn't king when this happened. He was probably in his 50s or maybe even 60s already, an old man by medieval standards. Maybe he was a prince, maybe a military commander, sources are unclear. But he was there when Angkor fell, and he did something extraordinary. He organised a resistance, gathered the scattered troops, fought back. And over the next few years, it probably took 3 or 4 years of guerrilla warfare, he drove the Cham out and reclaimed the city. By around 1181, J7 has won. He's crowned king. And at an age when most people are thinking about retirement, he's about to embark on the most ambitious building program in Khmer history. But here's what makes him different from every king who came before. He's seen the empire's vulnerability. He's seen what happens when you trust in divine protection and military might. He's watched the old system fail spectacularly. So he changes everything. Starting with the gods themselves, J7 converts to Buddhism. Not the animist-influenced folk Buddhism that had been quietly coexisting with Hinduism for centuries. No, he goes all in on Mahayana Buddhism, which has a very different philosophy than what came before. Instead of warrior gods like Shiva and Vishnu, the central figure is now Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. Someone who has achieved enlightenment but chooses to remain in the world to help others achieve it too. Someone who hears the suffering of the world and responds with mercy. Think about what a shift this represents. For 350 years, the Khmer have worshipped powerful, sometimes wrathful deities, gods who demand sacrifice and tribute, gods who help you conquer your enemies, and suddenly the king is saying, actually what matters is compassion. What matters is alleviating suffering. It's like if the United States suddenly decided to replace all military bases with hospitals and meditation centers, that level of philosophical upheaval, and J7 doesn't just talk about it, he builds it. Let me tell you about the welfare state he created, because this is genuinely remarkable and doesn't get talked about enough. According to inscriptions, and these are official records carved in stone, so we can trust the numbers, J7 built 102 hospitals throughout the kingdom. 102. These weren't just places where the local healer might live. These were actual institutions with building staff medicine supplies. The inscriptions even list what medicines each hospital stocked: honey ginger, cardamom, camphor, various herbal remedies. There were doctors assigned to each hospital. There were procedures for distributing medicine. This was organised healthcare at a scale that wouldn't be seen in Europe for another 700 years, and he built 121 rest houses along major roads. These were like medieval motels, places where travellers could stop, get water, maybe a meal rest for the night, completely free, funded by the kingdom. Why? Because in Buddhist philosophy, alleviating suffering is how you accumulate merit, how you progress toward enlightenment. And the king, as the supreme Buddhist in the kingdom, has an obligation to care for his people. Can you imagine a modern politician saying, we're going to build 102 free hospitals and 121 free hotels and we're funding it from the treasury? They'd be laughed out of office. But J7 did it. Of course someone had to pay for this, and we'll get to that. But first let's talk about what he built in Angkor itself. After the Cham invasion, the old city felt vulnerable, so J7 builds a new fortified city centre. It's called Angkor Thom, literally Great City, and it's surrounded by walls 26 feet high and 8 miles long, with a moat outside that's over 300 feet wide. Inside those walls, he builds his masterpiece, the Bayon Temple. Now I need you to picture this, because the Bayon is unlike anything else in Angkor, unlike anything else anywhere really. It's a temple mountain at the exact centre of Angkor Thom, and it has 54 towers. On each tower, carved from the stone itself, are 4 gigantic faces. These faces are about 7 feet tall, larger than life-size. They're looking out in all 4 cardinal directions. That's 54 towers times 4 faces each, versus 216 faces total. 216 faces, all with this enigmatic, gentle smile, all watching, all seeing, all knowing. Stand in the middle of the Bayon, and no matter which direction you look, you're being watched by these serene, smiling faces. It's beautiful and unsettling and profound all at once. Who do the faces represent? That's the question that's haunted scholars for over a century. Some say it's Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, hearing the cries of the world. Some say it's the Buddha himself. Some say, and this is the theory I find most intriguing, it's Jayavarman VII, that he literally put his own face on 216 towers to watch over his people, not as ego but as duty. I'm always watching. I'm always here. You're not alone. There's actually some evidence for this. Photos from the early 20th century compared with known portraits of J7 show similarities in the facial features. The broad face, the slight smile, the serene expression. If that's true, if J7 really did immortalize himself as the embodiment of compassion on 216 towers, that's either the most beautiful or the most narcissistic thing any king has ever done. Maybe both. History's complicated like that. But here's what gets me stand in front of one of those faces today and it still works. That smile still makes you feel something. Seen, protected, maybe judged but gently. It's one of the most powerful artistic achievements I've ever experienced, and there are 215 more of them. The Bayon isn't just about the faces. The galleries contain over 1,000 square meters of bas-reliefs, more than Angkor Wat. But while Angkor Wat shows mythological scenes, the Bayon shows everyday life. There are scenes of the Khmer fighting the Cham, and you can identify which side is which because they dress differently, wore different hats. There are scenes of market women selling fish, cockfights, childbirth, gambling, a woman picking lice from another woman's hair, which sounds gross but was actually a sign of intimacy and care. This is history as documentary. This is what life actually looked like in the late 12th century. And it's carved in stone for anyone to see. There's even a scene showing Chinese merchants. You can tell they're Chinese because they're wearing the distinctive clothing and they have beards which Khmer men typically didn't grow. This is proof that international trade was happening, that Angkor was connected to the wider world. Walk through those galleries and you're not just looking at art, you're looking through a window into a vanished world. But let's talk about the cost of all this compassion, because there's a darker side to this story. J7 built Angkor Thom, the Bayon, 102 hospitals, 121 rest houses, dozens of other temples, roads, bridges, all of this in about 30 years, roughly from 1181 to 1210. He built more than any king before him, including the guy who made Angkor Wat. Where did the resources come from? Where did the labour come from? From the same place it always came from. The peasants. The farmers who were already working to feed themselves and grow surplus for the tax collectors. Except now they're also being drafted to quarry stone transport it, carve it, build hospitals in distant provinces, maintain roads they might never use. And unlike earlier kings who built gradually, J7 is in a hurry. He's old. He knows he doesn't have decades. So everything happens fast, which means more demands on more people in less time. Imagine you're a rice farmer. Your village is required to send 20 men to work on temple construction for 6 months. That's 20 fewer people to plant rice, to harvest rice. Your village still has to pay the same taxes, but with fewer workers. The burden on everyone left behind just got heavier. Some scholars think this is when the system starts to crack, when the demands finally exceed what the population can sustainably provide. And there's another change happening that's even more fundamental: the end of stone temple construction. In 1295, that's about 15 years after J7 dies, the last major stone temple is built at Angkor. The last Sanskrit inscription is carved the same year. After 500 years of continuous temple building, it just stops. Why? Partly because Buddhism doesn't require the same kind of monumental architecture that Hinduism did. Buddhist temples can be made of wood, which is cheaper and faster, but doesn't last. But also, and I think this is crucial, the population is exhausted. The resources are exhausted. The endless cycle of each king must build something more magnificent than the last has finally hit its limit. It's like a game of economic chicken, and J7's building program is when everyone realizes, we can't keep doing this. There's an inscription from J7's reign that I find heartbreaking. It talks about how he suffered when his people suffered, how he felt their pain as his own pain, how illness in the kingdom was the illness of kings and the pain of their subjects became their own pain more than their own pain. This is a king who genuinely seems to have cared, who tried to use his power to help rather than just dominate, who built hospitals instead of just armies. And yet his compassion might have been too expensive, his vision might have been too grand. The empire might not have been able to afford his kindness. That's tragic in a very particular way, isn't it? When the problem isn't cruelty or indifference, but ambition in the service of good. When you break something by trying too hard to fix it. J7 probably dies around 1218 to 1220, the dates are uncertain. And with his death, something fundamental changes in Angkor. The God-King model doesn't quite work anymore. If even a king as powerful and compassionate as J7 couldn't protect the empire from the invasion, couldn't solve all problems through divine authority, then maybe the whole system needs rethinking. Buddhism spreads. But it's a different Buddhism, Theravada, instead of Mahayana. A more individualistic practice. Less focused on big royal temples, more focused on personal meditation and local monasteries, the shift from state religion to personal religion, from monumental stone to modest wood, from centralized power to decentralized communities. This is the beginning of a transformation, not a collapse, not yet, but a slow, subtle shift in what Angkor is and what it means. And into this changing world arrives a visitor, a foreigner who will write down everything he sees, preserving for us a snapshot of Angkor in transition. A Chinese diplomat whose journal is basically a time capsule. Let's meet the man who saw Angkor alive and wrote it all down for us. If you could travel back in time with a notebook and spend a year in ancient Angkor, what would you write down? The big stuff, temples, armies, kings, or the small stuff? What people ate for breakfast, how they bathed, what they wore, who they gossiped about. In July of 1296, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou de Guan arrived in Angkor with exactly that opportunity. He stayed for 1 year, one complete cycle of seasons, and when he left, he wrote a memoir about everything he saw. And thank God he did, because Zhou's journal is the only detailed eyewitness account of Angkor while it was still alive, still functioning, still full of people. Without his observations, we'd be trying to reconstruct an entire civilization from silent stones and educated guesses. But here's what makes Zhou's account so fascinating. He's not trying to write history. He's just a curious foreigner writing about the weird and wonderful things he encountered. He's basically a 13th century travel blogger, and that makes his observations even more valuable. So let's walk through Angkor with Zhou. Let's see what he saw, and let's try to read between the lines for what he might have witnessed but didn't understand the subtle signs that this great civilization was already starting to change. Zhou de Guan arrives in Angkor in July 1296 as part of a diplomatic mission from the Yuan dynasty that's Mongol-ruled China Kublai Khan's empire. He's probably in his 30s or 40s, educated, observant, and fascinated by foreign cultures. The journey from China took him about 6 weeks by sea, sailing down the coast of Vietnam, then up the Mekong River system into Tonle Sap Lake. When he first sees Angkor from the water, the towers rising above the tree line, the massive stone walls of Angkor Thom reflecting in the water, he must have caught his breath. Because even by Chinese standards, and remember, China has the Forbidden City, the Great Wall cities of millions, even by those standards, Angkor is impressive. Zhou is assigned quarters somewhere in or near the city, and for the next 12 months he watches, he asks questions, he takes notes, and he's particularly interested in the things that are different from China, the exotic, the strange, the surprising. His resulting memoir is titled Records of Cambodia, or sometimes translated as Customs of Cambodia. It's not long, maybe 10,000 words total, but those 10,000 words are gold dust for historians. Let me tell you some of the things Zhou observed, starting with what people wore, or rather what they didn't wear. Zhou notes with what I imagine is some shock that Khmer men typically go shirtless, just a piece of cloth wrapped around the waist. No shoes. Even nobles and officials often go barefoot, though they might add jewellery or fancy cloth to show status. Women wear a single piece of cloth wrapped around the body, leaving the shoulders and arms bare, and here's what really surprises Zhou. Both men and women of all classes bathe publicly in the rivers and ponds throughout the city, multiple times a day, because it's hot and bathing feels good, and why wouldn't you? Zhou writes that even the king's wives and daughters bathe at the riverbank and men walk by and see them, and apparently nobody thinks this is scandalous. For Zhou, coming from a culture with very different ideas about modesty and privacy, this is absolutely wild. He also notes that women go bare-breasted until marriage. After marriage, they cover up, so you can tell at a glance who's married and who's not, which is actually a pretty practical system if you think about it. Now, modern scholars debate how accurate all of this is. Maybe Zhou is exaggerating because that's what travel writers do, right? Make things sound more exotic than they really are. But archaeological evidence, the bas-reliefs we talked about earlier, kind of backs him up. The carvings show women in various states of undress, show people bathing, show casual attitudes toward the body that are different from contemporary Chinese or European norms. Zhou is fascinated by the royal processions he witnesses, and his description gives us our only detailed account of what it was like to see the god-king in public. He writes that the king leaves the palace with much ceremony. First come the soldiers, an entire regiment, maybe thousands of men carrying spears and shields. Then musicians playing drums, gongs, horns, creating this cacophony of sound that you can hear from miles away. Then come palace women, hundreds of them, carrying gold and silver vessels, candles, decorative standards. all wearing elaborate costumes, jewellery glinting in the sun. Then ministers and princes on elephants surrounded by more soldiers carrying red parasols, and the number of parasols indicates rank. More parasols equals more important. And finally the king himself, riding on an elephant standing in a golden howdah holding his sacred sword. Above him, white parasols, white being the royal colour, and Joe specifically notes the king is wearing lots of gold jewellery, but he's basically dressed like everyone else. Shirtless cloth around the waist, even divine kings go casual in the tropics. The procession moves slowly through the city. People line the streets, they don't bow or kneel. Joe finds this interesting, but they press their hands together in respect as the king passes. Can you imagine seeing this? The colour, the sound, the spectacle. This isn't just government. This is theatre. This is religion made visible. This is power you can hear and see and feel. But Joe doesn't just describe royal pageantry. He describes regular life, and that's where his account becomes incredibly valuable. He talks about food. The Khmer don't eat wheat rice as the staple. They eat fish in enormous quantities, mostly fermented into fish sauce and fish paste. Vegetables, fruits. Meat is less common, but available. They drink palm wine. They chew betel nut, which stains their teeth red, and Joe finds this disgusting. But the Khmer think it's sophisticated and attractive. Cultural differences, he describes how women dominate commerce. They run the markets, handle money, negotiate prices. Men do fishing and farming and heavy labour. But when it comes to trading, that's women's work, and they're apparently very good at it. Joe notes this because in China, commerce is typically male-dominated, so seeing women confidently running businesses surprises him. He talks about the legal system. Minor disputes are settled by local officials. Major crimes go before the king's court. For serious accusations where evidence is unclear, they use trial by ordeal, which sounds barbaric, but was actually common in medieval cultures worldwide. One example Joe gives: the accused and the accuser both have to sit in water. Whoever can stay under longer wins the case. The logic being that the guilty person weighed down by their guilt will struggle to stay submerged, while the innocent person buoyed by truth can hold their breath longer. Is this justice? Not by our standards. But it's a system, and apparently people believed in it. Joe describes marriage customs, and some of these are genuinely fascinating. He writes that girls are deflowered in a ceremony between ages 7 and 11 by a Buddhist priest, or sometimes a Chinese merchant. This practice is called Chen Tan in his account. After this ceremony, girls are considered eligible for marriage. Modern historians read this and go, wait, what is Joe describing an actual practice? A coming-of-age ceremony that he misunderstood. A ritual he heard about but didn't witness. There's debate about this, and it makes us realise Joe is an outsider. He might get things wrong, he might misinterpret. His account is valuable, but not necessarily always accurate. He also notes that marriage is easy. If you want to get married, you do. If you want to divorce, you do. Women can remarry without stigma. This is surprisingly progressive for the 13th century. In medieval Europe, divorce is basically impossible. In China, it's complicated and women face serious social consequences. But in Angkor, apparently if it's not working out, you can move on with your life. Now let me tell you about one detail in Joe's account that breaks my heart a little, because it describes something beautiful that no longer exists. Joe writes that the towers of the Bayon Temple are covered in gold. He describes them as gleaming in the sun, visible from miles away, this golden beacon at the centre of the city. Today, when you visit the Bayon, the towers are grey stone, weathered, beautiful but not golden. What happened? Over the centuries, the gold was stripped away. Maybe during later wars, maybe just gradually stolen by people who needed money, maybe melted down and taken when the capital moved south. But for a brief moment in 1296, Joe saw the Bayon as it was meant to be seen, radiant, glowing, a literal city of gold at the heart of the empire. And now all we have is his description. The gold is gone, but the memory preserved in his journal remains. Here's what's interesting about what Joe doesn't say. He doesn't mention any major problems. No food shortages, no rebellions, no obvious decline. To Joe, Angkor seems prosperous and stable. The king is powerful. The city is functioning. Yes, there are wars with neighbouring kingdoms, but that's normal, expected. Yes, the climate is harsh, but the Khmer have systems to handle it. Reading Joe's account, you'd never guess that within 135 years this city will be mostly abandoned, that the empire is approaching its end. So either Zhou isn't seeing the problems, he's a short-term visitor, after all only there for a year, or the problems are subtle, not yet obvious, even to people living through them. This is what makes the fall of Angkor so mysterious. It's not dramatic, it's not sudden. There's no apocalypse, just a slow fade that people in 1296 can't see coming yet. But there are hints in Zhou's account if you know where to look. He mentions that maintaining the irrigation systems requires constant work. That sedimentation is a problem. That canals need regular cleaning. This is new information. Earlier inscriptions don't emphasize maintenance, they emphasize construction. The shift from building new to maintaining old that suggests the system is aging, becoming harder to manage. He describes religious changes. The adoption of Theravada Buddhism is accelerating. Wooden temples are being built more than stone ones. The focus is shifting from royal cults to local monasteries. This matters because royal temple building was how the economy circulated wealth. The king builds a temple which employs thousands, which spreads money through the society. Wooden temples are cheaper, employ fewer people, create less economic activity. He notes that Chinese merchants are becoming more important in trade networks. This is significant because it suggests the maritime trade routes going through ports to the south, not through Angkor, are becoming more lucrative. Why bring goods all the way up the rivers to Angkor when you can sell them at coastal ports? These aren't disasters. These are shifts. Small changes that will compound over decades into fundamental transformation. Zhou also gives us details about warfare that are chilling in their casualness. He describes a recent war with Siam, that's Thailand, where the Khmer lost. He doesn't dwell on it, just mentions it in passing. The Siamese are becoming more powerful. They're encroaching on Khmer territory. The balance of power is shifting. Remember, empire is never permanent. There's always someone at the borders waiting for weakness, looking for opportunity. For centuries, the Khmer were the strong ones, the ones expanding. But power is fluid. The Siamese are rising. And the Khmer, after Jayavarman VII's exhausting building programs, might not have the resources to push back effectively. Zhou doesn't say this explicitly, but you can feel it between the lines. One more detail from Zhou that I love. He describes how people tell time. They don't have clocks or watches, obviously. Instead, they observe the behavior of animals and the position of the sun. There are temple elephants and their behavior indicates the time of day. There are water clocks vessels that fill at a steady rate with markings to show hours. At night, they burn incense candles that are marked with segments. When the incense burns down to a certain mark, you know how much time has passed. It's a completely different relationship with time than we have. Time isn't precise, it's approximate. It's not measured in minutes, it's measured in cycles. The cycle of the sun, the burn rate of incense, the behavior of elephants. And honestly, there's something beautiful about that. Time as a flow rather than a series of ticks. Time is something you observe rather than something you track. But I'm romanticizing. For farmers who need to coordinate irrigation schedules, for merchants who need to meet deadlines, imprecise time is frustrating. Still, there's a different pace to life when you're not checking your phone every 5 minutes. Zhou Daguan leaves Angkor in July 1297, exactly 1 year after he arrived. He sails back to China, eventually retires, and sometime later writes his memoir. For about 600 years, his account is mostly forgotten, known to Chinese scholars, but not widely read. Then in the 19th century, when French colonizers start exploring Angkor, someone remembers, hey, didn't a Chinese diplomat write about this place? They find Zhou's text, translate it. Suddenly archaeologists have a guide. Zhou's descriptions help them identify which temple is which, what various structures were used for. His account becomes the Rosetta Stone for understanding Angkor. And here's the beautiful irony: Zhou thought he was just writing travel notes, recording curiosities to share with friends back home. He had no idea he was preserving the only detailed picture of a civilization at its twilight. That his casual observations would become priceless historical evidence. Sometimes the most important documents are the ones written without any sense of importance, just someone paying attention, just someone writing down what they saw. So now we have the full picture. We've seen Angkor rise from river villages to a sprawling metropolis. We've watched the god kings build temples and hydraulic systems and empires. We've walked through the city with Zhou, seeing it alive and vibrant in 1296. And now we have to ask the question we've been circling around this entire time. What happened next? Why did this magnificent city, still prosperous, when Zhou visited, end up abandoned? Why did a civilization that had endured for 600 years finally fade away? The answer isn't simple. It's not a single catastrophe. It's a perfect storm of factors, each one perhaps manageable alone, but together, creating a crisis the empire couldn't survive. Climate, infrastructure, religion, economics, war, all of them colliding at once. Let's unravel the mystery of Angkor's fall. You want to know the scariest thing about the fall of Angkor? It wasn't dramatic. There was no volcano eruption, no plague that killed everyone in a week, no alien invasion. Just a series of problems that individually were manageable, but together created a cascade failure that couldn't be stopped. It's like watching someone slowly go bankrupt. At first, they miss one credit card payment. No big deal. Then another. Then they start choosing between electricity and food. Then they're selling their furniture. And suddenly, before anyone realizes it's happened, they've lost everything. That's what happened to Angkor. Except instead of credit card debt, we're talking about droughts, floods, religious upheaval, economic shifts, war and disease, all happening at once, all feeding into each other, creating a perfect storm that even the mightiest empire in Southeast Asia couldn't weather. So let's talk about how paradise died, not with a bang but with 100 small wounds. The first clue to Angkor's downfall was literally written in trees, and we didn't discover it until 2010. A researcher named Brendan Buckley, tree-ring scientist from Columbia University, was hiking through the Cardamom Mountains in Cambodia, about 100 miles from Angkor, and he was looking for very old trees. Specifically, he was looking for trees that had been alive during the Angkor period, because trees record climate data in their rings. You probably learned this in elementary school, right? Wide rings mean good growing years with plenty of rain. Narrow rings mean drought stress, bad times. It's like the tree is keeping a diary of the weather, one ring per year. Buckley and his team drilled core samples from ancient cypress trees. Some of these trees were over 1,000 years old. They'd been saplings when Angkor Wat was being built. And when they analysed the rings, they found something absolutely stunning. Between roughly 1362 and 1392, that's 30 years, the rings are consistently thin. Abnormally thin. This isn't normal drought. This is mega drought. 3 decades of below-average rainfall, and then just when things should improve between 1415 and 1435, it happens again. Another 20 years of severe drought. Buckley's team published these findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010, and historians reading it went, oh, that explains so much. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Between those drought periods, there were years of extreme monsoons, not just heavy rain, catastrophic flooding. So picture this. You're a farmer in 14th century Angkor. For years, maybe decades, the rains are weak. Your rice harvest is poor, the reservoirs are low, everyone's hungry, the kingdom's rice reserves are depleted, and then finally the rains come back. Except they don't just come back, they come back with a vengeance. Torrential monsoons that overwhelm the canal system, flooding that washes away fields, water moving so fast and so violently that it erodes, the embankments damages the spillways, fills the canals with sediment. The system that was designed to capture and store water is now being destroyed by too much water. This is called climate variability, and it's deadly for hydraulic civilizations. You can adapt to consistent conditions, even if they're harsh. But when conditions swing wildly from one extreme to another, that break systems. Modern climate models confirm this. The 14th and 15th centuries saw unusual variability in the monsoon patterns across Southeast Asia. Something was happening with ocean temperatures, atmospheric circulation patterns, the kind of thing that creates decades of chaos. And Angkor, with its 1 million people, dependent on a complex water system, was uniquely vulnerable. Let me explain how the hydraulic system failed, because this is fascinating in a terrible way. The system had been built incrementally over 500 years, each king adding new reservoirs, new canals, connecting them to the old ones. It was this incredible, intricate network. But that complexity became a weakness. Recent archaeological work using ground-penetrating radar and sediment analysis has shown that by the 14th century many canals were heavily silted up. Remember all that deforestation from earlier? All that earth moving to build temples and platforms. When you remove trees, soil washes into waterways during monsoons. Over centuries this adds up. The canals were getting shallower. They needed constant dredging to function, and dredging requires labour, thousands of workers with shovels and baskets clearing mud. During the drought years, the kingdom is stretched thin. Food is scarce, workers are weak. The economy is struggling. Maintenance gets deferred. We'll clean the canals next year when things are better. But next year is also a drought, and the year after that, and after that. And then the floods come dumping even more sediment. The canals that haven't been properly maintained for decades can't handle the volume. Water goes where it shouldn't. Embankments breach. Suddenly neighbourhoods are flooding that were never supposed to flood. The system isn't managing water anymore, it's becoming part of the problem. In 2009, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used computer modelling to simulate what happens when a complex hydraulic network starts failing. The results were dramatic. The system can reach a tipping point where small failures cascade into larger ones. One broken canal affects 3 others. Those 3 affect 10 more. And suddenly the whole thing collapses. That's probably what happened at Angkor. Not a single catastrophic event, but cascading failures that nobody could get ahead of. Now, while the water system is failing, something else is happening. The religious foundation of the empire is eroding. Remember how the God-King system worked. The king is divine. The king builds temples to prove his divinity. The temples employ thousands of people, distribute wealth, demonstrate the king's power and connection to the gods. But Theravada Buddhism, which is spreading rapidly in the 13th and 14th centuries, doesn't work that way. In Theravada Buddhism, enlightenment is personal, individual. You don't need massive royal temples. You don't need the king to mediate between you and the divine. You need personal practice meditation, a simple monastery, maybe a good teacher. That's it. So what happens to the economy when people stop believing in god-kings? When they stop thinking royal temple building is spiritually necessary? The whole system of tribute taxation and labour service starts to lose its justification. For centuries, farmers accepted heavy taxes because those taxes built temples that maintained cosmic order, that kept the gods happy, that ensured prosperity. It was an exchange. You give labour and rice, you get divine protection and infrastructure. But if enlightenment is personal, if the monks are teaching that temples don't matter as much as meditation, that cosmic order doesn't depend on kings, then why are we building these massive monuments? Why are we breaking our backs for royal vanity projects? The ideological foundation of the entire empire is shifting, and nobody planned for this. Nobody said, hey, what if our state religion stops supporting the state? There's an inscription from the late 13th century that breaks my heart a little. It's on a temple called Mangalatha, and it talks about how the king tried to build it but couldn't finish because he ran out of resources. For 500 years, Khmer kings built whatever they wanted. Resources appeared, labour appeared, temples got finished. And now suddenly a king is admitting, we can't do this anymore. That's not just economic failure, that's psychological defeat. That's the moment when the empire realizes it's not what it used to be. Meanwhile, the economic geography of the region is changing. For centuries, Angkor's power was based on controlling the interior, the rice-growing plains, the river systems. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, maritime trade with China is exploding. The Mongols have conquered China. The Yuan dynasty wants goods from Southeast Asia, spices, exotic woods, resins, that sort of thing, and they're willing to pay very well. But here's the thing, ships can't sail to Angkor. It's inland. You'd have to go up the Mekong through Tonle Sap, then transfer goods to smaller boats. It's inefficient. But ports on the southern coast, ports near what will become Phnom Penh, those can handle ocean-going vessels. Those can trade directly with Chinese merchants, so trade routes shift. Wealth starts flowing to coastal areas instead of to Angkor. The elites start thinking, why are we living in this inland city that's having water problems and food shortages when we could be on the coast getting rich from maritime trade? By the 14th century, archaeological evidence shows that elite residences in Angkor Thom are being abandoned. Not all at once, not dramatically, just gradually empty. People moving away one family at a time, seeking opportunities elsewhere. It's like when a Rust Belt city in America starts declining. At first, it's just a few factories closing. Then younger people start leaving for better jobs. Then businesses close because there are fewer customers. Then more people leave. And 50 years later, you've got a city that's 1/3 its former size, that's Angkor in the 14th century, dying not with a scream but with a slow exodus. And then there's the military threat that everyone talks about, the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya is founded in 1351, and from the beginning, they're aggressive, they're expansionist, they model themselves culturally on Angkor, they adopt Khmer art, Khmer architecture, Khmer political systems, but they're determined to surpass their model. Throughout the late 14th and early 15th centuries, there are constant wars between the Khmer and the Siamese. Sometimes the Khmer win, sometimes the Siamese win. It's exhausting and expensive for both sides, and in 1431 Ayutthaya launches a major attack. They besiege Angkor for 7 months, and when the Khmer finally negotiate peace, the Siamese withdraw. But they take massive amounts of loot and thousands of people as captives. For centuries, historians said, that's when Angkor fell. 1431, done. But recent archaeology says, not exactly. Archaeological evidence shows people were already leaving Angkor before 1430. The city was already in decline. The attack was more like the final push than the sole cause, and after 1431, Angkor isn't completely abandoned. Some people stay. Monks definitely stay. We know Angkor Wat remained a Buddhist temple continuously from the 15th century onward. Villages around the area persist. It's not a dramatic end. It's a transition. The capital moves south closer to the coast to take advantage of maritime trade. Phnom Penh becomes important. The centre of Khmer civilization shifts, but the civilization itself doesn't die. There's one more theory I need to mention, even though it's controversial: malaria. In the 1990s, a French parasitologist named Pierre Huguet proposed that Anopheles dirus, a species of jungle mosquito, might have played a role in Angkor's decline. Here's the theory. As the city loses population, rice fields are abandoned. These fields get overgrown with vegetation. Eventually they revert to forest, the natural habitat of Anopheles dirus, which carries particularly deadly strains of malaria. As the forest encroaches closer to inhabited areas, malaria cases spike. People get sick. More people leave. More fields are abandoned. More forest grows. More mosquitoes. More malaria. It's a death spiral. Modern studies have shown that Anopheles dirus is incredibly efficient at transmitting malaria, much more so than other mosquito species, and it thrives in the exact kind of transitional forest edge habitat that would have existed around a slowly depopulating Angkor. We don't have direct evidence of a malaria epidemic. Parasites don't fossilize, and we don't have medical records. But it fits the pattern. It explains why population decline might have accelerated once it started. Once you reach a certain tipping point, the environmental changes make the city increasingly uninhabitable. So let me summarize the perfect storm climate: decades of drought followed by catastrophic floods. The worst climate variability in centuries, hitting at exactly the wrong time. Infrastructure: a complex hydraulic system that had worked for 500 years finally breaking down from age, deferred maintenance and climate stress. Religion: the ideological foundation of divine kingship eroding as Theravada Buddhism spreads, removing the spiritual justification for massive temple building and labour service. Economics: trade routes shifting to coastal ports, making the inland capital less strategically valuable. Military: constant warfare with Ayutthaya, draining resources and eventually leading to a devastating attack in 1431. Disease: possibly malaria, spreading as abandoned areas reverted to forest, creating perfect mosquito breeding grounds. Any one of these may be manageable, all of them at once impossible. And here's what really haunts me. The people living through this probably didn't realize what was happening. It wasn't obvious. 1 bad year, okay, we'll recover. 2 bad years, we'll manage. 3 bad years, we'll tighten our belts. By the time it's been 10 bad years, 15-20, it's too late to reverse course. The damage is done. They couldn't see the big picture. They couldn't see that their civilization was dying. They just saw individual problems, individual hard years, individual setbacks. Do you ever wonder if we're in the same situation right now? If our civilization is experiencing a slow decline that will be obvious to historians 500 years from now, but isn't obvious to us because we're living through it. By 1500, Angkor as a major urban centre is finished. The king rules from Longvek, then later from Udong, then eventually from Phnom Penh. The temples remain slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. A few monks maintain Angkor Wat. Villages persist in the area, but the great metropolis, the city of 1 million people, the hydraulic paradise that's gone. Not destroyed, not burned to the ground, just empty, quiet. The stone buildings stand, the canals slowly fill with silt, the reservoirs become lakes, trees grow through doorways, roots wrap around towers, and the jungle, patient and inevitable, takes back what was always hers. But that's not the end of our story. Because Angkor may have been forgotten by the wider world for a few centuries, but it was never truly lost. And when the modern age arrives, when explorers and archaeologists start digging, they're going to find something extraordinary. They're going to find a city that refuses to stay buried, a civilization that speaks across centuries, and a mystery that keeps getting more complex the more we learn. Let's talk about what happened when the world rediscovered Angkor. Here's a weird thing about history. Sometimes the most famous story about something is completely wrong. For over a century, the story of Angkor went like this. Magnificent civilization mysteriously vanishes. Jungle swallows everything. Local people forget it ever existed. Then, brave European explorer hacks through the vegetation and discovers lost temples. The end. It's a great story, very dramatic, very Indiana Jones. There's just one problem. Almost none of it is true. Angkor was never lost. The local people never forgot. And the European discoverers weren't discovering anything, they were being shown around by guides who knew exactly where everything was. So let's set the record straight. Let's talk about what really happened when Angkor disappeared, and how the myth of the lost city became more famous than the truth. Because this story tells us as much about colonialism and who gets to write history as it does about archaeology. And then we'll talk about the real discovery, the one happening right now with lasers and satellites and technology that's revealing Angkor was even more incredible than we ever imagined. Let's start with the most important fact: Angkor Wat never stopped being used. Not for a single day. When the capital moved south to Longvek around 1434 and then to Udong in 1618 and eventually to Phnom Penh in 1865, Angkor Wat remained an active Buddhist temple. Monks lived there continuously. They maintained it. They repaired what they could. They performed rituals. We have inscriptions from the 16th and 17th centuries carved right into Angkor Wat's walls. Buddhist pilgrims coming to pray, leaving their marks. If the temple was lost and forgotten, someone forgot to tell the monks who were living there. And the other temples, the ones that really were overgrown local villagers, always knew about them. They farmed around them. They incorporated some of the smaller structures into their homes. Kids played in the ruins. These weren't mysterious unknowns, they were just there, part of the landscape. Imagine if 500 years from now, after some apocalypse, people said the Statue of Liberty was lost and forgotten, just because the government moved to a different city. That's basically what we're talking about here. The first Europeans to write about Angkor were Portuguese missionaries and traders in the 16th century, the 1500s, about 100 years after the capital relocated. A Portuguese monk named Antonio da Madalena visited Angkor Wat around 1586 and wrote a fairly detailed description. He thought it might have been built by Romans, which, okay, that's hilariously wrong, but he clearly saw it, documented it, and his account survives. Other Portuguese visitors left records too. Spanish missionaries may have passed through. These weren't secret expeditions. They were just people traveling for trade or religious purposes who stopped by and wrote, "Hey, saw this amazing temple complex, pretty cool." But Europe in the 16th century wasn't particularly interested in Southeast Asia yet. These reports got filed away in archives and largely forgotten by Europeans. The local people obviously continued to know exactly where their temples were. In 1672, a Japanese pilgrim came to Angkor Wat and was so impressed he drew a floor plan and took it back to Japan. That drawing still exists. Again, not exactly lost. Then we get to the 19th century, and this is where the myth really takes off. In August 1850, a French missionary named Charles-Émile Bouillevaux published an article mentioning Angkor. He'd visited in 1850, but France wasn't paying much attention yet. 10 years later, in January 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot arrives in Cambodia. He's not looking for temples, he's collecting butterflies and beetles, and plants for natural history museums in France. This is his job. He's basically a bug guy. But someone, almost certainly a local guide, tells him about Angkor, takes him there, shows him around, and Mouhot is absolutely blown away. He writes in his journal, "One of these temples are rival to that of Solomon, and erected by some ancient Michelangelo might take an honourable place beside our most beautiful buildings." He makes drawings, takes measurements, documents everything he can. And here's what's important. In his journals he explicitly acknowledges that Portuguese visitors had been there before him. He doesn't claim to be the first European to see Angkor. He's actually pretty humble about the whole thing. But then tragedy strikes. In 1861, Mouhot dies of fever while exploring Laos. He's only 35 years old. His journals are sent back to France and published posthumously in 1863 in a book called Travels in Siam, Cambodia and Laos. And the French press goes wild. French explorer discovers lost city in the jungle. The headlines practically write themselves. Never mind that Mouhot never claimed to discover it. Never mind the Portuguese, never mind the Japanese pilgrim, never mind the thousands of Cambodian people who knew exactly where it was. This is the narrative that Stick's brave Frenchman discovers forgotten civilization. Why does this narrative take hold? Because it's useful. France and Britain are competing for colonial influence in Southeast Asia. Britain has Burma. France wants Cambodia and Vietnam. And discovering Angkor gives France a perfect justification. Look at this magnificent civilization. Someone needs to protect these ruins. Someone needs to study them. Might as well be us, right? In 1863, same year Muhot's journals are published, France establishes a protectorate over Cambodia. Coincidence? Probably not entirely. And to be fair, French archaeologists did do important work. In 1898, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient is founded in Hanoi. By 1907, they establish a permanent mission at Angkor. They clear vegetation. They prop up collapsing structures. They photograph everything. They decipher inscriptions. They create the first comprehensive archaeological and historical understanding of the Khmer Empire. Scholars like George Codes, Maurice Glaise and Bernard-Philippe Grolier dedicate their careers to Angkor. They produce work that's still valuable today, real scholarship, real archaeology. But they frame it all as rescuing a civilization that the Cambodian people had lost and forgotten. And that framing is colonial nonsense. The Cambodian people hadn't forgotten their heritage, they just weren't writing academic papers about it in French. Throughout the 20th century, restoration work continues. After Cambodia gains independence in 1953, Cambodian scholars start taking the lead in their own heritage. Indian teams come to work on Angkor, Japanese teams. It becomes an international effort, but then everything stops. Abruptly. Horribly. April 17, 1975. The Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, takes control of Cambodia. And what follows is one of the darkest chapters in modern history. The Khmer Rouge wants to create a pure agrarian communist society. They empty the cities, force everyone into agricultural labour camps, kill anyone with education, anyone who speaks foreign languages, anyone associated with the old government, anyone who wears glasses because glasses suggest you can read, and reading means you're educated, and educated people are enemies of the revolution. Between 1975 and 1979, approximately 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians die. That's about a quarter of the entire population. Through execution, through starvation, through forced labour, through disease. It's genocide on a horrific, incomprehensible scale. Archaeologists flee if they can. Many are killed. All research stops. The temples are neglected. Some are damaged, not systematically destroyed, but caught in the chaos. Landmines are planted throughout the area. And here's something that breaks my heart. Even during this nightmare, even when the country is bleeding, Buddhist monks try to protect Angkor Wat. Some stay, some hide, some die, but they try. In January 1979, Vietnamese forces invade, and the Khmer Rouge regime collapses. The world starts to learn what happened, and Cambodia begins the long, agonizing process of recovery. In 1992, UNESCO designates Angkor as a World Heritage Site. International teams return, restoration work resumes. But now it's different. Now it's a collaboration. Cambodian archaeologists trained in their own right work alongside international teams as equals, not colonial subjects. And that's when things get really interesting. Because in the 1990s and 2000s, new technology becomes available. Technology that changes everything we thought we knew about Angkor. In 2012, a team led by Australian archaeologist Damien Evans uses something called airborne LiDAR light detection and ranging. Basically, they fly a helicopter over the jungle and shoot millions of laser pulses at the ground. The lasers penetrate the vegetation, bounce back, and create a detailed 3D map of what's underneath. The first survey covers about 370 square kilometres around Angkor, and what they find is absolutely mind-blowing. Angkor isn't just a collection of temples in a forest. It's a vast planned urban landscape. The LiDAR reveals neighbourhood after neighbourhood laid out in perfect grids. Streets, ponds, canals, earthworks, structures that had been invisible under the jungle canopy for centuries. They find evidence that the greater Angkor metropolitan area covered over 150 square kilometres, that's 440 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's larger than modern-day Los Angeles. Larger than any pre-industrial city anywhere on Earth. The population estimates get revised upward. Maybe not 1 million, maybe more, maybe significantly more. And here's what really gets me near Angkor Wat. They find these mysterious spiral earthworks, 6 massive coils of earth, each one precisely shaped, arranged in a pattern. Nobody knows what they were for. They're not mentioned in any inscription. They're not described by Zhou Daguan. They're just there. A mystery carved into the landscape 800 years ago. Were they decorative symbolic part of the water system gardens? We don't know. We have no idea. After 150 years of studying Angkor, we're still finding things that surprise us, still discovering mysteries. In 2015, they run more LiDAR surveys, expand the coverage, and they find more undiscovered temple complexes, entire cities nearby that historians didn't know existed, evidence of an even larger network of settlements across the region. One of the most exciting finds is at Mahendraparvata. Remember that mountain where Jayavarman II declared himself God King? Turns out there's an entire city up there, the oldest capital of the Khmer Empire hidden under jungle on a mountaintop. The LiDAR shows streets, buildings, infrastructure, a city that predates Angkor itself. Archaeologists have started excavating. Every dig reveals something new: pottery, tools, inscriptions, pieces of a puzzle we're still putting together. Here's what kills me about this. We've been studying Angkor for over 150 years. Thousands of scholars have dedicated their careers to it. We've written libraries full of books about it. And we're still wrong about fundamental things. We're still discovering we vastly underestimated its size, its complexity, its sophistication. What does that tell you about the arrogance of assuming we understand ancient civilizations? What does that tell you about how much we still have to learn? Every time we think we've figured Angkor out, it reveals another secret, another layer, another mystery. It's like the city is playing a very long game with us. Oh, you think you understand me? That's cute. Here's something you missed. And you know what's really beautiful? The people leading this research now, more and more of them are Cambodian. After decades of having foreigners tell them about their own history, Cambodian archaeologists and scholars are reclaiming their heritage. They're using the same technology, conducting their own research, making their own discoveries. The Apsara Authority, the Cambodian government body that manages Angkor, employs hundreds of people. Archaeologists, conservators, guards, guides. They're the ones making decisions now about how to preserve and present Angkor to the world. That shift matters. That's the real rediscovery, not French colonizers in the 1860s, but Cambodian people in the 21st century reclaiming agency over their own past. Modern Angkor is a complex place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's Cambodia's most famous landmark, literally on the flag. It's a major tourist destination, drawing over 2 million visitors per year, before COVID generating about 20% of Cambodia's GDP. But it's also a living religious site. Monks still live at Angkor Wat. People still come to pray. It's not a museum, it's a temple that happens to have tourists. And that creates tension. How do you preserve ancient stones while allowing access to millions of visitors whose footsteps wear them down? How do you maintain religious sanctity while running what's essentially a massive tourist operation? How do you balance economic needs with conservation? There's no easy answer. It's a constant negotiation. But at least now it's Cambodian people doing the negotiating. One more thing I want to tell you about because it's weird and wonderful. Angkor Wat has become a symbol that transcends its origin. It's been on every version of the Cambodian flag since 1863. Even during the Khmer Rouge period, even that regime put Angkor Wat on their flag. That's how central it is to Cambodian identity. During the Civil War, during the Vietnamese invasion, during all the chaos, neither side bombed Angkor Wat. It was basically the one thing everyone agreed was off limits. Even in war, even when everything else was negotiable, Angkor Wat was sacred. What kind of building commands that level of respect? What kind of architecture transcends politics and conflict to become universally precious? Only a handful of structures in the world have achieved that status. The pyramids, the Parthenon, maybe the Taj Mahal. Angkor Wat is in that category, a building so significant that it belongs not just to Cambodia but to humanity. And that's both beautiful and a little sad, right? Because it started as a very specific thing, a Hindu temple built for a specific god king in a specific political moment. And now it's this universal symbol, this tourist destination, this icon that means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. Has it gained something in that transformation, or lost something, maybe both? So where does that leave us? After all this, the rise, the fall, the forgetting that wasn't really forgetting, the discovery that wasn't really discovery, the modern revelations that keep changing our understanding. I think it leaves us with humility. with the recognition that history is never simple, that there are always multiple stories, multiple truths, that the stones remember more than we can read, and it leaves us with curiosity. Because even now, after all we've learned, Angkor still has secrets, still has mysteries. Those spiral earthworks near Angkor Wat still unexplained, the full extent of the hydraulic system still being mapped, the exact population still debated, the city refuses to be fully known. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries should remain mysteries, but that doesn't mean we stop asking questions, stop searching, stop learning. Because every answer reveals new questions, and that's what makes this fascinating. So let's bring it all together. Let's talk about what Angkor means not just for history, but for us right now, facing our own complex challenges in an uncertain world. So, here we are. We've walked through 600 years of history together. We've watched a civilization rise from rice fields and river villages to become the greatest metropolis the medieval world had ever seen. We've seen it stumble, transform, and fade into the jungle. We've watched it disappear without actually disappearing, and then reveal itself again through lasers and satellites and patient archaeology. And now comes the question that matters most. So what does a jungle empire that peaked 800 years ago have to teach us right now? In our modern world of smartphones and skyscrapers and space stations, why should we care about stone temples and hydraulic engineering and god kings? Because here's the thing, we're not so different from the Khmer. We face the same fundamental challenges they did, and the patterns that destroyed them, those patterns are still playing out today. We just call them by different names. So let's talk about what Angkor teaches us, not as history, as warning, as wisdom, as hope. Lesson number 1. Complexity is beautiful, but fragility comes free with a package. The Khmer built the most sophisticated hydraulic system in the pre-industrial world. It was a masterpiece of engineering. And that complexity allowed them to support 1 million people in an environment that could normally handle maybe 100,000. But complexity is a multiplier. It multiplies both success and failure. When the system worked, it worked magnificently. When it started failing, the failures cascaded. One broken canal affected 3 others, those 3 affected 10 more. And before anyone could stop it, the entire network was compromised. Look around at our modern world, our supply chains, our electrical grids, our internet infrastructure, our financial systems. They're all magnificently complex, brilliantly engineered, and they work so well that we barely think about them until they don't. In 2021, a single ship, the Ever Given, got stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days. 6 days. And global trade ground to a halt. Billions of dollars in losses, goods delayed for months, all because one ship blocked one canal. In 2003, a tree branch touching a power line in Ohio triggered a cascade failure that left 50 million people without electricity across the northeastern United States and Canada. One tree branch, 50 million people. We've built systems that are more complex, more interconnected, more efficient than anything the Khmer could have imagined. And just like them, we're vulnerable to cascade failures that can bring the whole thing down. The question is, are we maintaining these systems? Are we building in redundancy? Are we preparing for the inevitable moments when things break? Or are we like 14th century Angkor, deferring maintenance, assuming the system will always work because it always has right up until it doesn't? Lesson number 2. Climate is not background noise. It's the stage on which all of civilization performs. The Khmer built their empire during a period of relatively stable monsoons. Sure, there were droughts and floods, there always are in Southeast Asia, but they were predictable, manageable. The hydraulic system could handle normal variation. And then in the 14th century, the climate went haywire. Mega droughts lasting 30 years, extreme floods, variability that the system couldn't accommodate because it was calibrated for different conditions. And the empire couldn't adapt fast enough. By the time they realized how serious the problem was, they'd already passed the point where solutions were possible. Now, I'm not saying climate change will destroy modern civilization the same way it contributed to Angkor's fall. We have better technology, better science, better global communication, but we also have a lot more people, a lot more infrastructure calibrated to current climate conditions, a lot more agricultural systems dependent on rainfall patterns staying roughly similar to what they've been for the past few centuries. What happens when rainfall patterns shift, when droughts last longer, when floods get more severe, when coastlines change? We're running an experiment in real time, and the Khmer's experience suggests that even sophisticated civilizations, can be blindsided by climate changes they don't see coming until it's too late. The difference is they couldn't see it coming. They didn't have climate science. They couldn't measure atmospheric CO2 or model future scenarios. We can. We have the data. We have the models. We can see what's coming. The question is whether we'll respond with the same urgency that the situation demands, or whether we'll keep deferring action, assuming we'll deal with it later when it's more convenient when the politics are better. History suggests that later often turns out to be too late. Lesson number 3, the stories we tell ourselves matter more than we realize. For 500 years, the Khmer believed in divine kingship. The king wasn't just politically powerful, he was cosmically ordained. And that belief justified everything: the taxes, the labor service, the massive building projects. It all made sense within that story. And then the story changed. Buddhism spread. The new narrative said enlightenment is personal. You don't need kings mediating between you and the divine. You don't need massive temples. You need individual practice and compassion. That's a beautiful philosophy. But it undermined the entire economic and political structure of the empire. The system was built on one story, and suddenly everyone was living in a different story. And the system couldn't adapt. What are the stories our civilization tells itself? What narratives justify our economic systems, our political structures, our social arrangements? Progress is inevitable. Growth is always good. Technology will solve our problems. The market is efficient. Democracy leads to prosperity. Hard work leads to success. Some of these stories are true, or at least useful. Some are partially true. Some might be becoming less true as conditions change. And some might have always been myths we told ourselves to make sense of chaos. What happens when these stories stop resonating? When people stop believing? When the narrative that held everything together starts to fray? I don't have answers. But I know this civilizations run on belief as much as they run on resources, and when belief erodes, everything else becomes harder. The Khmer couldn't see this coming. They thought their system was eternal because it had always worked, right up until it didn't. Are we making the same mistake? Lesson number 4, and this is the one that keeps me up at night. Success creates blind spots. For 600 years, the Khmer Empire was the dominant power in Southeast Asia. They were successful, powerful, wealthy. They built things no one else could build. They ruled territories no one else could conquer, and that success probably made them complacent. When you're on top for that long, you start to think you'll always be on top. You start to think the rules don't apply to you. You stop being able to imagine your own failure, and then the Siamese rise, and the climate shifts, and the system starts breaking, and suddenly you realize, oh no, we're not invincible, we're not eternal, we're just as vulnerable as everyone else. But by the time you realize it, you've lost the ability to respond effectively. Your institutions are too rigid. Your thinking is too locked into old patterns. You can't adapt fast enough. Does this sound familiar? Are there modern powers that think they're too big to fail, that assume their dominance is permanent, that can't imagine a world where they're not on top? History is littered with empires that thought they were eternal. Egypt, Rome, Persia, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the British. Every single one of them thought their system was the natural order of things, and every single one of them was wrong. The only constant in history is change. The only certainty is that nothing lasts forever. The question is whether we're humble enough to accept that, whether we're flexible enough to adapt when conditions change, whether we can see our own blind spots before it's too late. But here's the lesson that gives me hope, and this is the most important one. Endings are also beginnings. Angkor didn't die. It transformed. The capital moved. The economy adapted. The culture evolved. The people survived. Yes, there was loss. Yes, there was trauma. Yes, it must have been devastating for people living through it. But the Khmer people didn't vanish. They rebuilt. They adapted. They persisted. Cambodia still exists. Khmer culture still exists. And Angkor, the lost city, the forgotten empire, is now one of the most recognized landmarks on Earth. It generates billions of dollars in tourism. It's on the national flag. It's a source of immense pride. From abandonment to resurrection. That's the real story of Angkor. And that's the lesson I think we need most right now: resilience. The capacity to survive change. The ability to let go of what no longer works and build something new. The future won't look like the past. Our children will live in a world different from ours in ways we can't fully predict. Climate will change. Technology will change. Social structures will change. That's guaranteed. The question isn't whether change will happen. The question is whether we'll be flexible enough to adapt, whether we'll be wise enough to learn from past mistakes, whether we'll be compassionate enough to help each other through transitions. The Khmer faced climate chaos, economic upheaval, military threats, infrastructure failure, and ideological transformation all at once. And they survived. Not unchanged, not without loss, but they survived. If they could do it with medieval technology and limited understanding of what was happening, what can we do with modern science, global communication, and the ability to learn from history? That's not naive optimism. That's realistic hope. It's the recognition that humans have always been resilient, always been adaptable, always found ways to persist even through catastrophic change. Stand in Angkor today, and I really hope all of you get the chance to visit someday, and you'll feel something profound. The stones are ancient, weathered, beautiful in their decay. Tree roots wrap around towers like they're embracing them, like nature is gently reclaiming what was always hers. But people are there too. Monks in orange robes walking to morning prayers, tourists from around the world taking photos, local guides telling stories passed down through generations, archaeologists carefully excavating new discoveries, children playing in the shadows of towers that have stood for 900 years. The city isn't dead. It's alive in a different way, transformed, evolved, still speaking to us across centuries, and that's the real victory, isn't it? Not that the buildings last forever, nothing lasts forever, but that they last long enough to teach us, to inspire us, to remind us that humans are capable of extraordinary things. The Khmer built for eternity, and in a way they succeeded. Not because stone is eternal, stone crumbles eventually, but because they created something meaningful enough that we still care, still study, still learn from, still draw inspiration from. That's immortality of the kind that actually matters. So what do we take from this journey? What do we carry forward from our time walking through the jungle empire that vanished? I think we take humility, the recognition that even the mightiest civilizations are fragile, that complexity creates vulnerability, that climate matters, that maintenance matters, that the stories we tell ourselves matter. We take wisdom, the knowledge that cascade failures are real, that deferred problems compound, that success can create blind spots, that change is inevitable. And we take hope, the certainty that humans are resilient, that endings are also beginnings, that transformation is possible, that even after the jungle reclaims the city, the story continues. We are living in our own version of the 14th century right now. We're in that moment when problems are starting to compound, but solutions are still possible if we act. We can see what's coming in ways the Khmer never could. We have the tools, the knowledge, the technology. The question is whether we'll use them, whether we'll learn from history or repeat it, whether we'll be remembered as the generation that saw the warning signs and responded, or the generation that knew what was coming and did nothing. That's not written yet. We're still in the chapter where the ending is uncertain. We're still making choices that will determine what archaeologists might say about us 1,000 years from now. And that's both terrifying and empowering. Because it means the future isn't fixed. It means we still have agency. It means that what we do matters. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for spending these hours walking through temples, meeting god kings, watching the rise and fall of a civilization that dominated Southeast Asia and then quietly faded into the forest. I hope you learned something. I hope you felt something. I hope that somewhere in this story you found echoes of your own life, your own challenges, your own hopes and fears. Because that's what history is for, isn't it? Not just to tell us what happened, but to help us understand what's happening now, to give us perspective, to remind us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a continuous story of human striving and failing and trying again. The stones of Angkor remember 600 years of history. They remember glory and decline, success and failure, ambition and humility. They remember that nothing lasts forever, but some things last long enough to matter. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. To build something meaningful, to learn from our mistakes, to adapt when conditions change, to help each other through transitions, to persist. The jungle took back the city, but the story lives on, in stone, in memory, in the lessons we carry forward, in the questions we ask ourselves about what kind of world we're building and what kind of ancestors we want to be. So sleep well tonight knowing that you're part of that story, that the choices you make, however small they seem, are writing the next chapter, that your compassion matters, that your wisdom matters, that your resilience matters. Dream of temple towers reaching toward the sky, of stones that remember, of cities that refuse to stay buried, of civilizations that transform but never truly die. Dream of roots and stone intertwined, of nature and humanity in eternal conversation, of endings that are also beginnings. And when you wake up, remember we're all building Angkor. Every day, every choice, every act of maintenance or neglect, every moment of wisdom or blind spots, every instance of resilience or surrender. The story isn't over, it's just changing form, and you're part of it. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. Other vanished cities, other forgotten empires, other mysteries written in ruins and whispered by stones, other lessons from civilizations that rose and fell and rose again. If you want to explore more of these journeys with me, I'll be here, because the past is full of secrets, and we've only just begun uncovering them. Until we meet again, sleep peacefully. Let the story of Angkor settle into your dreams. Let the stones whisper their wisdom. Let the jungle remind you that transformation is natural, that endings are necessary, that resilience is always possible. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being here. Good night, everyone. And remember, everything ends. But the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, the compassion we show, the wisdom we gain, those echo forward through time. Just like Angkor, still teaching, still inspiring, still reminding us what humans are capable of when we build. With purpose, adapt with wisdom, and persist with hope. The jungle empire vanished, but its voice remains. Listen carefully, it's still speaking. Good night.